The hall was never quiet at the best of times, but on the morning King Aldric made his announcement, it went silent in a way that felt almost physical, like the air itself had stopped moving and was waiting to hear what came next. Caspian Voss stood near the eastern wall, exactly where he always stood when he was required to be present, but had no interest in participating. 3 steps from the nearest column, close enough to look like he was paying attention, far enough that no one could easily pull him into conversation. He had perfected this position over many years, and the court had long ago accepted it as simply the way the Duke of Voss arranged himself in a room. He was 31 years old. He had survived a war that killed most of the men who had stood beside him. He had governed a duchy the size of a small country for 3 years, largely without help, largely without complaint. His face carried a scar that ran from the outer corner of his left eye down to his jaw, not dramatically, not in the way that soldiers in old stories wore their wounds like decorations, but plainly and permanently, the way a healed thing simply is. The court had many quiet opinions about the scar. Caspian had none. It was part of his face. He had stopped noticing it the way a person stops noticing the sound of a clock after the first few hours in a room. What the court noticed more, if it was being honest with itself, was his stillness. Most men of his rank moved through a room with an awareness of being watched, and that awareness shaped them, the way they turned their heads, the way they smiled, the way they reached for a glass of wine. Caspian moved as though no one were watching, because he genuinely did not care whether they were or not. This, paradoxically, made him difficult to look away from. He was wearing dark gray, as he almost always did. His gloves were on, as they almost always were. The candles in the great hall of the palace burned steadily. There was no wind today, no breath of air from outside, and the light they threw was warm and golden, and wasted entirely on a room full of people performing their best versions of themselves for an audience of each other. King Aldric was 62, and looked it without apology. He was a compact, broad-shouldered man who had gone fully gray somewhere in his late 40s, and had never seemed troubled by it. He stood at the center of the raised platform at the north end of the hall, with the relaxed confidence of someone who had been standing on platforms for 4 decades, and found them comfortable. He had a goblet in his left hand. He had not yet drunk from it. He had called them all here, he said, because he had a matter of some importance to address. The court straightened almost imperceptibly. Important matters were the reason they got out of bed in the morning. The king looked around the room with the particular expression of a man who was genuinely enjoying himself and was not especially concerned about whether anyone else was. He said that it had come to his attention, and here he paused just long enough for the pause to feel deliberate, that the Duke of Voss had not yet taken a wife. A current moved through the assembled nobility, not a loud current, a quiet, electric one, the kind that passes through a crowd when everyone realizes simultaneously that the thing they suspected was about to happen is actually about to happen. Caspian did not move. He was very good at not moving. The king continued. He said that this was a situation he had decided to remedy personally. He said that among the unmarried noblewomen present in the court that morning, the Duke of Voss was welcome to choose any bride he desired. He said it in exactly those words. Any bride you desire. The way a man offers a friend the first pick of something, without expecting any particular outcome, as though the choice were simple, and the world were simple, and desire were something a person could simply point at. There were, by Caspian's count, approximately 40 women in the hall who qualified under those terms. He had counted them when he walked in, the same way he counted exits, and counted the number of armed men in any room he entered. Old habits from the war. The counting was not hostile. It was simply how his mind organized spaces. He looked at them now, not all at once, but methodically, the way he read a map. He was looking for something without knowing quite what he was looking for, which was unusual for him because he generally preferred to know what he was looking for before he began. The women were extraordinary, in the precise technical sense of that word. They had been assembled over months by the careful machinery of court life into the most polished versions of themselves possible. Lady Cordelia Marsh stood in the front with her gold hair arranged in a crown of braids that must have taken her attendants 2 hours this morning. The Harcastle daughters, 3 of them, ranging in age from 19 to 23, stood in a cluster near the center of the room, each wearing a different shade of blue, which was almost certainly a coordinated decision. The Countess of Renfield had come from her estate 3 days' ride away, and was wearing the kind of jewels that were meant to be noticed first, and the woman wearing them second. They were all beautiful. Several of them were genuinely kind. At least 2 of them were considerably more intelligent than anyone in the room had bothered to find out. None of this was lost on Caspian. He was not looking past them. He was simply aware, in the wordless and almost instinctive way that he was aware of most things, that none of them were what he was looking for. He still did not know what he was looking for. And then he did. She was standing behind the second column from the right, approximately 7 feet from the nearest wall, in the specific location that a person chooses when they need to be technically present in a room, but would prefer not to be noticed in it. She was not hiding. She was not trying to hide. She had simply positioned herself in the way that a very practiced invisible person positions themselves, close enough to an architectural feature that the eye slides past her without fully registering her, far enough from the center that she was not part of the main picture. She was perhaps 22 or 23. She was wearing dark green, not the vivid green of fashion, but the quiet green of old cloth that had been well cared for. Her hair was dark and pinned up in a way that was neat and correct, and had clearly been done by her own hands, rather than by an attendant's. She was holding a book. Not hiding the book, not tucking it under her arm with the particular guilty awareness of someone who knows the book is inappropriate, and is trying to minimize its visibility. Simply holding it, the way a person holds something that belongs to them, with the automatic and uncomplicated grip of ownership. She was not watching the king. She was not watching the other women. She was not watching Caspian, who had been the object of most of the room's watching since the king began speaking. She was reading. Or, more precisely, she was trying to read. Her eyes were on the page, but her jaw was tight in the specific way of someone making a conscious effort to ignore something that was demanding their attention, and her thumb was pressed flat against the cover of the book, in a grip that had nothing to do with keeping the page open. She knew exactly what was happening in this room. She was simply choosing not to participate in watching it happen. Caspian looked at her for 4 seconds before he started walking toward her. He did not decide to start walking. He was simply still, and then he was moving, and the decision, if it could be called that, had already been made somewhere below the level of deliberate thought. The court noticed him moving, before he had taken 5 steps. This was the nature of the court. It tracked him the way a field tracks weather, not because it was trying to, but because something in the collective nervous system of assembled nobility always knows where the most consequential person in a room is, and what direction they are moving. The women who had been watching him watched the room, which was most of them, and they had been doing it with the focused and practiced attention of people who have spent considerable energy preparing for this morning, felt the shift before they understood it. The gold-haired Lady Cordelia Marsh straightened slightly. The Harcastle daughters leaned fractionally closer together. The Countess of Renfield's expression did not change, because she had spent 40 years making sure her expression never changed without her permission. But something shifted behind her eyes. He walked past all of them. He walked steadily, without hurry, in the direction of the second column from the right, approximately 7 feet from the eastern wall, where a young woman in dark green was holding a book and trying very hard to pretend she was somewhere else. He stopped in front of her. She did not look up immediately. She looked up the way a person looks up when they have decided that whatever is in front of them requires their attention, despite their preference that it not, which is a different kind of looking up than the kind prompted by surprise. Her eyes met his, and stayed there. Her eyes were dark brown, clear. She did not look frightened. She looked, more than anything, like someone running a rapid internal calculation about what was actually happening, and whether it meant what it appeared to mean. He said her name. He said it clearly and completely. Marin Ashvale. The way you say a name when you have looked it up and want to make clear that you have looked it up and are not guessing. He had looked it up. He had spent 3 days since the king first mentioned the announcement, going through the court records with a thoroughness that his steward had found both admirable and slightly alarming. He knew who every woman in this room was. He knew their families, their circumstances, their histories, their lands if they had lands, and their debts if they had debts, and the reasons they were here, and the reasons some of them had almost not been here. He knew Marin Ashvale was the 3rd daughter of a house that no longer existed in any practical sense. He knew her father had died 6 years ago with significant debts, and no sons and 2 older daughters, who had since married into minor families in the southern provinces. He knew she had been included in the court register, on the basis of a technicality, The Ashvale name was old enough that its holder still qualified for court functions, even when its practical resources had long since evaporated. He knew she had been living for the past 3 years as a kind of unofficial reader and correspondence assistant to the elderly Lady Prentice, who was genuinely fond of her, and who had brought her to the capital this season as a companion rather than as a contender for anything. He knew the court had almost certainly not bothered to keep track of her since she arrived, because the court tracked things that mattered, and Marin Ashvale, by the court's accounting, did not matter. He had come to a different conclusion. She looked at him. The calculation was still running behind her eyes. Her grip on the book had not relaxed. She said, "Yes? Not yes, my lord. Not yes, your grace. Simply yes," with the particular inflection of someone who has learned to make the word carry as much information as necessary, depending on who it is directed at, and who, at this exact moment, was using it to ask a question rather than answer one. He said he hoped he was not interrupting. She looked at the book in her hand. She looked back at him. She said, "You were not." Behind them, the great hall of the king's palace had achieved a quality of silence that the people inside it would, in later years, remember as one of the loudest things they had ever heard. The king was still on his platform. He had not moved. He was watching with the expression of a man watching something he had not precisely predicted, but was finding considerably more interesting than what he had predicted. The Lady Cordelia Marsh had stopped straightening. The Harcastle daughters had stopped leaning. The Countess of Renfield's expression had finally changed, for the first time in several years. Caspian was aware of all of this the way he was always aware of a room, peripherally, constantly, without particular attention, and he set it aside the way he set aside all peripheral information when something more important was happening in front of him. He told Marin Ashvale that he would like to speak with her, if she was willing. She did not smile. She did not flutter. She looked at him with the clear and slightly wary eyes of someone who has learned that unexpected attention from powerful people is rarely straightforwardly good news, and who is trying to work out what this particular piece of unexpected attention is going to cost. She said she supposed that depended on what he wanted to speak about. He said he would explain that, if she was willing to hear it. A pause, short but real. She said, "All right." He offered his arm, because the occasion and the audience required it. She looked at his arm for one moment, with the expression of someone looking at a door they have not decided whether to open. Then she tucked the book more firmly under her other arm, and placed her hand on his with the careful and slightly formal air of someone performing an action they have been taught, but do not particularly feel. They walked toward the side door that led to the gallery corridor, and the court watched them go the way it watches all things that it does not understand and cannot classify, with total attention, perfect silence, and a hunger to make sense of something that has just refused to make sense on its own terms. Behind them, the king lifted his goblet and finally drank from it. In the gallery corridor, which was long and stone and lined with windows that let in the flat morning light, Caspian stopped walking when they were far enough from the door that the sound of the hall behind them had faded to a low murmur. He turned to face her. She was already looking at him. She had been looking at him since they left the column, with the specific attention of someone who is gathering information and does not intend to pretend otherwise. He said, "I am going to be honest with you, because I find it more efficient than the alternative." She said nothing. She waited. He said that the king had given him an offer this morning that he had known was coming for some months. He said he had spent the time before it arrived looking at the available options, not because he was treating the situation as a transaction. He used that word precisely, transaction, and he watched her register it, but because he believed the decision warranted the same quality of attention he gave to any decision that would affect the rest of his life. He said he had been paying attention to her since she arrived at court 6 weeks ago. She said, "I have never seen you pay attention to me." He said, "That is rather the point of how I pay attention." She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softening, not warming, but adjusting, the way a person adjusts their footing when they realize the ground they are standing on is different from what they assumed. She said, "What did you notice?" He said, "That you read during functions you are required to attend, that you choose books in the library that are neither fashionable nor light, that you have a way of moving through a room that suggests you are used to moving through rooms without being seen, that when Lady Prentice is unwell, you handle her correspondence yourself, and that you handle it considerably better than her previous secretary did. A pause. She said, "You read her correspondence." He said, "I read everyone's correspondence. I am responsible for a significant portion of this kingdom's northern trade routes, and Lady Prentice's estate controls 3 river crossings that matter a great deal to those trade routes. Her correspondence is professionally relevant to me," she said, "and I appeared in it." He said, "You appeared in it." Another pause. This one was different from the first. The first had been her deciding something. This one was something else. The particular quiet of a person finding the ground slightly different from what they had assumed, and choosing what to do with that information. She said, "What is it you want, exactly?" He said, "I think you know." She said, "I would like you to say it." He said it, clearly, simply, with none of the ceremony that the situation would conventionally have demanded. He said he wanted to marry her, if she was willing to consider it, and that he understood, if she needed time to think about it, and that if she decided against it, he would respect that, and she would not find herself penalized for it in any way he had the power to prevent. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Why me?" He said, "Because you were the only person in that room who was reading." She looked at the book still tucked under her arm. She looked back at him. She said, "That is not a reason." He said, "It is the beginning of one." The light in the gallery corridor moved. A cloud had passed over the sun outside, and the flat morning brightness dimmed for a moment. And in that dimness, the corridor was very quiet, and they were very far from the hall full of people who were currently, without question, talking about nothing else. Marin Ashvale held her book and looked at the Duke of Voss and thought about what it meant, that a man she had never spoken to had been paying attention to her in a way she had never detected, and that this information was somehow both alarming and, if she was being honest with herself, the most interesting thing that had happened to her in 3 years. She said, "I will think about it." He said, "That is all I am asking." They stood in the gallery corridor for a moment longer, and the light came back as the cloud passed, and somewhere behind the closed door to the great hall, the court was composing the first draft of the story it intended to tell about what had just happened, and it was almost certainly nothing like what had actually happened, and neither of them cared. Marin turned and walked back toward the door. She did not look back, but her grip on the book, Caspian noticed, had finally relaxed. She did not sleep that night. Not because she was frightened. She had stopped being frightened of things she could not control somewhere around the age of 14, when the walls of the Ashvale estate had begun to show the particular kind of slow deterioration that comes not from neglect but from the absence of money to prevent it, but because her mind would not be quiet, and she had learned over the years that the most productive thing to do with a mind that refused to be quiet was to let it run until it ran out of road. She sat in the small room that Lady Prentice had given her at the edge of the Prentice apartments, which were comfortable but not large, and looked at the candle on the desk, and thought. Her name was on a list somewhere. That was the first fact. It was a short list, in the sense that the list was simply the court register of unmarried noblewomen, but it was still a list, and being on a list meant being evaluated, and being evaluated meant being found either sufficient or insufficient, and Marin had spent enough of her life being found insufficient that the word had developed a particular weight in her thinking. Not painful anymore, just heavy, the way an old injury stops hurting, but still affects how you walk. She had been found insufficient in the following ways, over the course of her 23 years. She was a third daughter, which was already a deficit in a world that valued first daughters and sons above all others. She had no fortune, because her father had spent the last decade of his life making a series of financial decisions that his creditors had found very interesting, and his family had found very expensive. She had no great beauty, in the specific sense that beauty was measured in court circles. No gold hair, no fashionable height, no mother's gems restrung to emphasize her coloring. She was, if she was being precise about it, the sort of person who could stand in a room of 40 women and be statistically invisible. She was also, and this was the thing that the court had not yet found out about her, because it had not tried to find out anything about her, extremely good at thinking. She had spent the past 3 years in Lady Prentice's service, which was not a prestigious arrangement and had not been intended as one. Lady Prentice was 74 and owned 3 estates and a considerable fortune, and had been widowed for 11 years, and had the particular freedom of a very old woman with a great deal of money, who had stopped caring what anyone thought of her. She had taken Marin on originally because she needed someone who could read a financial ledger without making mistakes, and Marin had turned out to be someone who could read a financial ledger, write a letter that said exactly what it needed to say without a word more, organize a correspondence system that actually functioned, and have a conversation that Lady Prentice found interesting, which was rarer than the ledger skill. In 3 years, Marin had become, without the title or the salary that should have accompanied it, the actual operational center of Lady Prentice's household management. She had renegotiated 2 leases, resolved a boundary dispute with a neighboring estate without recourse to lawyers, and identified a pattern of minor theft in the Prentice household accounts that had apparently been running for 4 years before she arrived. She had done all of this quietly and without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing it, because drawing attention to the fact that she was doing it would have drawn attention to the fact that the previous steward had not been doing it, and the previous steward was the nephew of someone Lady Prentice was fond of, and Marin had learned early that the most effective solutions are often the invisible ones. She thought about what the Duke of Voss had said. She thought about it the way she thought about a financial ledger, systematically, starting with the facts she could verify, moving toward the conclusions those facts could support. Fact 1. He had said her name, her full name, correctly, in a room full of women, with considerably more obvious claims on the attention of a duke. This was not an accident. Accidents do not involve correct pronunciations of names. No one in that hall had spoken in recent memory. Fact 2. He had read her correspondence, or rather, and she was careful to be precise with herself about this, he had read Lady Prentice's correspondence, in which Marin appeared. This was not, in the ordinary sense, sinister. It was exactly what a duke responsible for northern trade routes would do if he were thorough, and everything about Caspian Voss suggested he was thorough. Fact 3. He had noticed things about her, specific things, the books she chose, the way she moved through rooms, the quality of the letters she wrote on Lady Prentice's behalf. These were not things a person noticed by accident. They were things a person noticed because they were paying attention, and paying attention was something you did when something was worth your attention. Fact 4. He had offered to respect a refusal. She had been turning this particular fact over in her mind since the gallery corridor, because it was the most unusual one. Men of his rank did not, in her experience, offer to respect a refusal. They offered the appearance of a choice, and then arranged the circumstances so that the choice was not actually a choice. The offer of a genuine refusal, clearly stated, with consequences attached to it, was not a social performance. It was a contract. Or it was intended to look like a contract in order to appear trustworthy. She sat with that possibility for a while. The candle burned. Outside the window, the city made the sounds cities make at night. Distant voices, the clatter of cartwheels on stone somewhere several streets over, a dog making its feelings known about something. She thought, there is a version of this where he is simply a careful man who has decided to want something and is approaching the acquisition of it with the same thoroughness he applies to everything else, and the consideration, and the honest language, and the offer of refusal are all part of how a careful man acquires things. She thought, there is another version of this where he means exactly what he said. She thought, the interesting question is not which version is true. The interesting question is what I would do if I knew. She looked at the candle. She had not been to the court library since the first week of the season, because the court library was a social space during the morning hours, and she had found it easier to read in her room. She went there at dawn, before anyone else was awake, and stayed until the sounds of the household beginning its day reached her through the corridors. She went back the next morning. She was sitting in the far window bay with a volume on river navigation and trade, when she heard the door open. She did not look up. She knew the sound of the library at this hour, the occasional creak of the building settling, the thin light through the eastern windows, the absolute absence of footsteps because no one else was here this early. There were footsteps now. They were unhurried. They moved with the specific weight and evenness of someone who is not trying to be quiet, and is also not trying to be loud, but is simply walking the way they walk. They stopped near her. She looked up. Caspian Voss was standing on the other side of the reading table, with a book in his hand, and an expression that conveyed, with admirable economy, that he was here for the library, and that if she was also here, that was her own business. He said, "Good morning." She said, "You followed me here." He said, "I am here because I come to this library at this hour most mornings when I am in the palace. You can ask the librarian. He has been mildly annoyed about it since last autumn." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, "Sit down then." He sat, not across from her, which would have felt like an interrogation, but at the other end of the table, where he opened his book and began to read it. She watched him for a moment, long enough to verify that he was actually reading and not performing reading, and then she went back to her own book. They sat in the library in silence for 1 hour and 40 minutes. This was, without either of them naming it as such, the most honest conversation they would have for some time. When the library began to receive its morning traffic, the clerks, the bored younger sons, the occasional actual scholar, she closed her book. He closed his at almost the same moment. She said, "Why are you not married already?" He said, "I have been somewhat occupied." She said, "You have been a duke for 3 years. Governing people who depend on you must create, rather than prevent the need for a partner in the work." He looked at her. Something in his face changed slightly. Not surprise, but the specific adjustment a person makes when they realize they are going to be required to be more honest than they planned. He said, "Yes, it does." She waited. He said, "I was not ready, before. I told myself it was because I was occupied. I was partly right." She said, "And now?" He said, "I am not entirely ready now either, but I believe waiting for readiness is a strategy that eventually fails." This was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years, possibly in her adult life, and it caught her somewhere below the ribs in the way that unexpected honesty sometimes does, not painfully, but with a kind of shock, the way cold water shocks and wakes you, rather than hurting you. She said, "That is a very candid thing to say to someone you are asking to marry you." He said, "I find candor generally more useful than its alternative." She said, "Most people find it uncomfortable." He said, "Most people do. I have stopped finding that a compelling reason to avoid it." She looked at her book. She looked at him. She said, "Tell me about the scar." He did not flinch. He did not look away. He had clearly been asked about it before, and had clearly, in the past, found ways to decline the question, but he looked at her now with the expression of someone deciding not to decline. He said, "It was a decision made very quickly, in a situation where the alternative to the decision was someone else's death. The particulars are not interesting." She said, "Were you afraid?" He said, "I do not think I had time to be." She said, "And afterward?" He said, "Afterward I had other things to be afraid of." He did not elaborate. He did not owe her the elaboration, and they both understood this, and she did not ask for it. She said, "I have a condition." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I will not be a decoration. I will not spend my days attending functions and being arranged and managed and consulted, for the appearance of being consulted. If I am going to be part of the running of anything, I will actually be part of it. If there is correspondence, I will read it. If there are decisions to be made about how the household operates, I will be part of making them. Not symbolically. Actually." He looked at her steadily. He said, "That is not a condition. That is a description of what I am looking for." She said, "Then why have you not found it before?" He said, "Because most people I have spoken to about the management of the duchy have wanted me to be grateful for their willingness to listen. You want to do the work." She looked at him. She said, "I have been doing the work for 3 years, for someone else's household, without the title or the credit. I am aware of what it costs. I am also aware of what it produces." He said, "I know. I have read the outputs." She said, "The river crossing dispute." He said, "And the accounts correction, and the Hatherley lease renegotiation." She said nothing for a moment. She was making a decision, and she wanted to make it clearly, without the fog of flattery or fear, or any of the other things that made decisions poorly made. She said, "I will give you an answer in 2 days." He said, "I will be here tomorrow morning." She said, "That was not an invitation." He said, "I come here every morning." She looked at him. He looked back. And somewhere in the careful, level quality of that mutual looking, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with the warmth of a beginning, but with the specific weight of two people recognizing that they are dealing with someone who is not going to be simple, and finding that interesting, rather than inconvenient. She said, "Do not bring that book tomorrow. Bring something better." He looked at the book in his hand. He said, "This is a survey of Eastern border policies from the last 40 years. She said, "I know what it is. Bring something better." She stood up, tucked her own book under her arm, and walked out of the library. He sat at the table with his Eastern border policy survey and looked at the space she had occupied, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not exactly warmth, and was not exactly calm, but was something in the vicinity of both, the feeling of having found the beginning of a road, and not yet knowing where it leads, but being interested in finding out. He came back the next morning. He brought a different book. She was already there. She looked at the book in his hand, which was a political history of the northern provinces, from a perspective she had read in summary, but not in full, and she said nothing about it. But she also did not look away from it immediately, which he correctly interpreted as approval. They sat at opposite ends of the table and read for 2 hours without speaking. When she stood to leave, she said, without looking at him, "I have decided." He waited. She said yes. Then she walked out of the library without elaboration, because she had given him the information, and the rest, as far as she was concerned, was logistics. He sat very still for a moment. Then he opened his book again, because there was still an hour before the library became public, and he had meant to finish the chapter on the southern migration patterns before the week was out. But he did not read the chapter. He sat with the book open in front of him, and the morning light coming through the eastern windows, and he thought about a woman who had decided to say yes to him in a library, on her own terms, in 2 words, without ceremony, and without performance, and he thought that this was, of all the moments in the past 3 years, the most real one. Outside the library, Maren was walking back through the corridor toward the Prentice apartments, holding her book and thinking about trade routes, because she had already made the decision, and now there was simply the matter of what came next. She was not afraid. She was not particularly warm toward what was coming either, not yet. But she was, for the first time in a long time, paying attention. When Lady Prentice heard the news, she put down her teacup very carefully, in the precise and deliberate way of a woman who is giving herself time to compose her expression before speaking. She said, "Caspian Voss." Maren said, "Yes." Lady Prentice said, "The Duke of Voss." Maren said, "Yes." Lady Prentice looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who has lived long enough to have seen many surprising things, and has developed a philosophical relationship with surprise, but who is nonetheless finding this particular surprise somewhat more surprising than average. She said, "How?" Maren said, "I was reading in the library." Lady Prentice said, "Of course you were." There was a pause. Lady Prentice said, "He is a serious man." Maren said, "Yes." Lady Prentice said, "He does not trouble himself with things he does not intend to follow through on." Maren said, "I am aware." Lady Prentice looked at her steadily, with the eyes of a woman who had watched Maren Ashvale operate for 3 years, and had formed a clear and well-evidenced opinion of her capabilities, and she said, "Then you will be all right." It was not a sentiment, it was an assessment, and Maren, who had learned the difference between the two over the course of 3 years, in close proximity to Lady Prentice, received it as what it was, the highest form of confidence the old woman possessed. She said, "Thank you." Lady Prentice picked up her teacup. She said, "You will write to me, often." Maren said, "Yes," she said, "and if he is ever anything other than what he appears to be." Maren said, "I know where you keep your lawyers." Lady Prentice looked at her for one more moment, and then something happened in her face that was not quite a smile, and was not quite sorrow, but was somewhere between both, in the specific territory of an old woman, watching something young and capable move toward a life she cannot follow it into. She said, "I know you do." They had tea, and they did not speak about it again, and in the morning, the paperwork began. The announcement was made on a Tuesday, in the formal way that court announcements were made. A written notice distributed to the appropriate offices, a public declaration in the throne room, a corresponding notice sent to the appropriate religious authority, and a set of paperwork that would have been impressive in its thickness, had either of them been the type to be impressed by paperwork. Maren was not there for the formal announcement. She was in the records office on the eastern side of the palace, going through the land register for the Voss Duchy, with the focused attention of someone who has been handed a large and complicated machine and wants to understand how it actually operates, before anyone asks her to operate it. The land register was 3 volumes, each the size of a large saddlebag, and they were organized in a way that suggested 3 different people had organized them at 3 different times, with 3 different philosophies about what organization was supposed to accomplish. She had already filled 4 pages of notes, and had identified 2 inconsistencies that were either clerical errors or something more interesting. The clerk who had provided the register had watched her begin the 3rd volume, with an expression that moved through surprise, into mild alarm, and then settled into a species of fascinated disbelief. He had served in the records office for 9 years. He had never before seen a newly betrothed noblewoman request the land register. He had also never seen anyone read the land register that fast. He said, carefully, "Can I bring you anything, my lady?" She said, without looking up, "The correspondence records for the Holt River crossing dispute from 2 years ago, if you have them filed here. And water, please, if it is not inconvenient." He said it was not inconvenient. He went to find both. The court, meanwhile, was having the morning it had been having since the previous day, which was the morning where the announcement had still been happening in real time in the Great Hall, and which had not, in the intervening hours, produced any satisfactory answers to the central question of what had happened and why. The central question was, in its simplest form, why her? This question was being asked in the sitting rooms of the palace apartments, in the corridors between the throne room and the chapel, in the dining hall over breakfast, and in the specific low-voiced conversations that happen between people who are trying to appear as though they are talking about something else. It was being asked by people who were curious, by people who were annoyed, by people who were struggling to locate themselves in a landscape that had just shifted, and by people who had simply never heard of Maren Ashvale, and were trying to establish whether she was a real person, or whether there had been some kind of clerical error. Lady Cordelia Marsh, who had worn the gold-braided hair, and who had been, by the general consensus of the court's informal but comprehensive ranking system, the most likely candidate for a duke in need of a wife, was sitting with her cousin, in the smaller of the 2 morning rooms, and was maintaining, with great effort, a tone of calm interest. She said, "I simply did not realize he was already acquainted with her." Her cousin, who was less disciplined, said, "No one was acquainted with her. That is rather the point, isn't it? No one has ever heard of her." Lady Cordelia said, "Clearly someone has." Her cousin said, "He looked at the whole room. He looked at everyone, and then he walked past everyone." Lady Cordelia said, "I noticed." Her cousin said, "I am only saying it is unusual." Lady Cordelia said, "Yes, it is." There was a pause that contained several things that neither of them said. Her cousin said, "She is not even, no offense, but she is not." Lady Cordelia said, quietly, "Do not finish that." Her cousin stopped. Lady Cordelia looked at the window. She was a practical woman, despite the gold hair, and she had been practical long enough to know that the energy spent being angry about a thing you cannot change is energy that could be used for something that might actually improve your situation. She was 21 years old, and she was not going to spend the next 20 years being the woman who was passed over by the Duke of Voss. She said, "We should invite her to dinner, before the official reception. It would be generous." Her cousin looked at her. Lady Cordelia said, "She is going to be a duchess. Being generous to her now costs nothing, and being ungracious costs considerably more." Her cousin said, "You are remarkably composed." Lady Cordelia said, "I am remarkably tired of being surprised by things I should have anticipated." This was, in its way, the court's first true response to what had happened. Not the open hostility that would come later, but this early, practical moment of adjustment. A few people were generous. More people were curious. A small number were quiet, in a way that had an edge to it, the kind of quiet that saves itself. Marin was not aware of any of this, because she was in the records office until early afternoon, and then she was in her room writing a letter to her older sister Delia, who was living in the South with her husband and their 2 children, and whom Marin had not seen in 14 months. The letter was not easy to write. She had written 3 drafts before she settled on the 4th, which began simply, "I have something to tell you," and then said what there was to say, in plain language, with the specific quality of someone who has learned to write honestly, because she has seen what the alternative produces. She wrote, "I know this will seem sudden. I want you to know that it is not sudden to me, although I understand why it will seem that way from where you are sitting. I also want to tell you that I am not frightened, and I am not being managed, and I made this decision myself." She wrote, "He read your letter from 2 years ago, the one about the crossing dispute. He read it because it affected trade routes he is responsible for. I know this because he told me, and I believe him, because the alternative explanation is that he has been secretly investigating me for purely personal reasons, and I am not important enough for that." She wrote, "I think he is a serious person. I think I am also a serious person. I think this is probably going to be difficult and interesting, and possibly good. I will write more when I know more." She signed it with her name and sealed it, and gave it to the courier that evening. Delia's reply arrived 4 days later. It was short, as Delia's letters tended to be. She had 2 children under 5, and a husband who ran a grain business, and she wrote when she could, and at length when she couldn't. The reply said, "I read every word 3 times. Send me everything as it happens. And Marin, I am glad it is you." The formal court reception for the betrothal was scheduled for the following Saturday. Marin was informed of this by the palace steward, who arrived at her door on Wednesday with a list of what was expected, what she was to wear, what time she was to be ready, and what movements she was to make during the course of the evening. She read the list twice. She wrote a note back to the steward that said, in polite but unambiguous terms, that she would attend the reception and appear when required, but that the movements she made during the evening would be determined by the evening itself, and not by a list prepared in advance, and that if there were specific moments that required her presence in a specific location, she would be grateful if those moments were identified so she could plan accordingly, but that otherwise she would manage herself. The steward read the note. He read it a second time. He wrote back to say that the specific required moments were as follows, and he listed them, and the note had the slightly clipped quality of a man who has been told something he did not expect and is being professionally gracious about it. She went to the reception. It was the largest gathering she had been part of in her adult life. The palace's great hall, which she had stood in 6 days ago, with a book and a determined lack of interest in what was happening, had been rearranged for the occasion. More candles, more flowers. The long tables moved to the walls to open the floor. The musicians placed in the upper gallery, so the music came from above and filled the space from the ceiling down. She was wearing a dress that Lady Prentice had provided, because the Ashvale finances did not run to reception gowns, and Lady Prentice had insisted, with the particular force of an old woman who will not be argued with about practical matters, that Marin was not going to attend her own betrothal reception in the dress she wore to the library. The dress was deep blue, well made without being ostentatious, and fit her in the careful way that good tailoring fits someone who is not the standard measurements, which she was not, being slightly shorter than average and more solidly built than the reed-like silhouette that court fashion currently preferred. She did not think about the dress. She wore it, and arrived, and entered the room, and immediately began cataloging the space with the same attention she gave to the land register and the correspondence files, because a room full of people who were in various states of opinion about her was a kind of ledger, and she wanted to know what was in it. Caspian found her approximately 11 minutes after she arrived. She knew it was approximately 11 minutes because she had been counting, not because she was waiting, but because the evening had a rhythm and she was keeping track of it. He came to her directly. He did not meander toward her. He did not make the social circuit first and arrive at her as though by accident. He walked through the room the same way he did everything else, with the particular directness of a person who has decided to do something and considers the additional steps of appearing to decide it in real time to be a waste of everyone's time. He said, "You look well." She said, "You look like you would prefer to be in the library." He said, "That is true every day." She said, "Then why do you come to these things?" he said, because governing a duchy requires the maintenance of relationships that cannot be maintained exclusively by correspondence. She said, that is a very practical answer. He said, I try to have practical answers. She said, try? He looked at her. Something in his face shifted in the particular way she was beginning to recognize. Not softening, exactly, but the slight relaxation of a man who has decided he can stop performing the version of himself that the room expects, and be the other version instead. He said, occasionally I have answers that are less practical. She said, I would like to hear one of those sometime. He said, I suspect you will. They stood together for a moment, and the room moved around them, and people came to pay their respects with the assorted expressions of the court at formal functions: warmth, calculation, curiosity, the performance of all three simultaneously, and Caspian handled them with a competence that she observed with the same attention she had given to the land register, noting what it told her about how he worked. He was precise with names. He remembered details about people, not flattering details, not the kind of details you remember to make someone feel noticed, but specific details that were relevant to their actual lives: the progress of a building project, the outcome of a legal matter, the health of someone's parent. He never lingered. He was present, and then he was not, and the people he spoke to walked away looking like they had received something without quite being able to identify what it was. She thought, he is genuinely paying attention to them, not managing them. Paying attention. She thought, that is more unusual than he probably knows. At some point during the evening she found herself standing near the Harcastle daughters, who were all three of them extremely well dressed, and who greeted her with the careful warmth of people who have discussed how to greet someone, and have arrived at careful warmth as the optimal choice. She was pleasant in return. She asked the eldest daughter about her family estate in the south, because she had read enough of the court records to know approximately where the Harcastle land was, and what kind of farming it supported, and the eldest daughter looked briefly surprised, and then genuinely pleased to discuss it, because no one at court ever asked about farming unless they were connected to farming, and the Harcastle eldest had spent 6 seasons at court, being interesting to no one about the things she actually cared about most. Maren listened. She asked a follow-up question. The conversation lasted longer than either of them had expected. On the other side of the room, the Countess of Renfield, who was watching everything the way she always watched everything, noticed the exchange and adjusted her assessment by a fraction, the way you adjust a piece of furniture that has been almost right for years, and you have finally moved 1/4 of an inch to where it was always supposed to be. The reception ended at the appropriate hour. Maren walked back to the Prentice apartments and changed out of the blue dress and hung it carefully. It was not hers, and would need to be returned in good condition, and sat at her desk, and opened the land register to the 3rd volume, because she was only halfway through it, and she had the evening, and she preferred being useful to being awake without purpose. She read until midnight. She went to bed. She did not have trouble sleeping this time. In the morning, she found a note slipped under her door. It was written in a precise, angular hand on plain paper, no seal, no formal heading, and it said, Volume 2 of the Register, page 147. There is an error in the boundary description that has been there for 23 years. No one has noticed because no one has read it carefully since it was recorded. I am curious how long it takes you to find it. She read the note twice. She went back to Volume 2. It took her 34 minutes to find the error, which was not in the boundary description itself, but in the survey coordinates that the boundary description referenced, which were transposed in a way that placed a specific parcel of river-adjacent land outside the duchy boundary when it should have been inside it. The practical consequence of this error, if anyone ever checked, was that a mill that had been operating under Voss management for 23 years was technically operating on land that did not belong to the Voss duchy. She wrote the note back. 34 minutes. The mill, on the Ashford tributary. The survey coordinates on the referenced instrument are transposed, 2 and 4 switched on the eastern bearing. The correction requires a resurvey and a corrected instrument filed with the Crown Land Office, not just an amendment to the register. I can write the filing if you want it done before the wedding or after. She slipped it back under his door, which was 4 doors down the corridor in the palace's guest apartment wing, because she had noted the location 3 days ago, and filed it the way she filed everything, without drama, and without particular significance, because information was information, and you never knew when it became useful. 40 minutes later, another note appeared under her door. It said, "Before." She opened the land register to the appropriate section and began writing the filing. Outside, the court continued its morning as courts do, with noise and appetite and the performance of importance. And inside the records, Marin Ashvale wrote a legal correction for a 23-year-old error, with the focused and almost physical pleasure of a person doing the thing they are actually built to do. She did not notice the morning passing. She rarely did, when the work was real. The filing took most of the afternoon. It was a careful document. She wrote it twice, the first draft as a working draft, the second as the final, and she compared them line by line before she folded the second and set it aside. The land register was back on the table beside her, open to the relevant page, and she had made a small, neat annotation in the margin in pencil, not pen, because pencil could be removed if she had made an error, and she sat back and looked at what she had done, and felt the specific satisfaction of a piece of work completed correctly. Someone knocked at the door. She said, "Come in." It was not Caspian, it was his steward, a man in his 50s named Hartwell, who had the face of someone who has spent decades professionally managing other people's affairs and has developed a very precise idea of what competence looks like. He was carrying a leather folder. He said, "The Duke asked me to bring these to you directly. Current season's estate accounts, the Holt River crossing management reports from the past 18 months, and the Northern Road maintenance contracts." She looked at the folder. She said, "All of them?" He said, "All of them." He set the folder on the table. He said, with the careful neutrality of a professional, "If you have questions about the accounts format, I am available until the 6th hour." She said, "Thank you, Hartwell." He said, "My lady." He left. She opened the folder. She read until the candle needed replacing. The first person who said it to her face was not someone she expected. She was in the small dining room off the east corridor, the one that was technically open to all palace guests but that most people bypassed in favor of the larger, better-appointed dining room on the western side, where the food was the same, but the audience was larger, and the seating arrangements more politically significant. Marin used the east dining room precisely because most people bypassed it. She could eat in something resembling peace and read the documents she had brought with her, which that morning were the Holt River crossing management reports that Hartwell had delivered the previous day. The woman who sat down across from her without asking was approximately 40, well-dressed, in the quiet way of someone who has money old enough not to need to announce itself, with the kind of composure that is either natural or very carefully constructed, and which is difficult to distinguish from the outside. She said, "You are Marin Ashvale." Marin said, "Yes." The woman said, "I am Lady Norville. My husband's lands border the Voss Duchy on the southeast." Marin said, "I know. The Norville boundary runs along the Aldenmere Creek. There was a shared drainage dispute in the records from 4 years ago, settled by agreement." Lady Norville looked at her. Something moved in her expression that was not hostility, but was in the neighborhood of it, a kind of sharp reassessment, the way you reassess someone who has surprised you in a way you were not prepared for. She said, "You have been reading the records." Marin said, "Yes." Lady Norville said, "May I ask why?" Marin said, "Because I am going to be the Duchess of Voss, and the Voss Duchy borders several estates including yours. And understanding the existing relationships and agreements seems like a reasonable starting point." Lady Norville said, "It is a more than reasonable starting point. It is not, however, the starting point most women in your position choose." Marin said, "I am aware of what most women in my position choose." Lady Norville said, "And you disagree with it?" Marin said, "I think most women in my position choose the starting points they are given. I am choosing my own." There was a pause. Marin took a drink of her water and looked at the woman across from her with the steady attention she gave to everything, which was neither hostile nor particularly warm, but was completely present, the way a person is present when they have decided to take someone seriously. Lady Norville said, "I am going to say something that may annoy you, and I am going to say it not because I intend it unkindly, but because I think you are a person who prefers useful information to comfortable silence." Marin said, "Correct." Lady Norville said, "There are people in this court who are going to make your life difficult. Not all of them, and not most of them, but enough. They will be quiet about it in ways that are hard to argue against. They will forget to include you. They will not say the wrong thing directly. They will simply fail to say the right thing at the right time. You will find, when you arrive at the Voss seat, that certain people who should have written have not written. Certain arrangements that should have been made will have been unmade quietly. Not because you have done anything wrong, because you are not who they expected, and they are accustomed to things being as they expected." Marin said, "I know." Lady Norville said, "I thought you might. I wanted to say it aloud because I believe it is more useful said than implied." Marin said, "It is. Thank you." Lady Norville said, "I have been the Norville wife for 22 years. When I arrived, I was not from a significant family. I was the daughter of a wool merchant. My husband chose me because he wanted someone who could actually run the estate, and I could, but that did not prevent the first 3 years from being the most instructive period of my life." Marin said, "Instructive." Lady Norville said, "It is a more useful word than difficult. Difficult suggests you are at the mercy of it. Instructive suggests you are learning." Marin looked at her. She said, "That is a very good distinction." Lady Norville said, "I thought you might appreciate it." There was another pause, this one different from the first. The pause of two people who have identified that the other is worth talking to, and are adjusting from the formality of a first meeting to the different air of a second conversation, beginning inside the first one. Marin said, "The Norville drainage management since the dispute settlement, is the shared maintenance agreement still working?" Lady Norville said, "Functionally, yes. Practically, we have found that the spring thaw creates conditions the original agreement did not account for, and we have been managing it informally, rather than through an amendment. It would benefit from being formalized." Marin said,
"I will put it on the list."
Lady Norville said, "The list." Marin said,
"I have a list of things to address once the wedding is concluded, and we have returned to the duchy."
"It is already somewhat long." Lady Norville looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I think you may surprise a number of people." Marin said, "I am not trying to." Lady Norville said, "I know. That is rather the point." They finished breakfast in a more comfortable silence than it had begun, and when Lady Norville stood to leave, she said, "I would be glad of a correspondence when you are settled at the Voss seat. There are several boundary matters that would benefit from your attention." Marin said, "Send them to me directly, not through a steward." Lady Norville said, "I will." The matter of what the court thought was not, of course, limited to useful women approaching her over breakfast. The less useful variety of opinion made its presence felt in other ways, in the particular silence that descended when she entered certain rooms, in the invitations that came for events to which Caspian had clearly been invited, but from which she had been omitted, in the small and exquisitely deniable ways that a community of people who are very practiced at being politely excluding can make someone understand that they are excluded, while maintaining total deniability about the fact. She catalogued these the way she catalogued everything, not with resentment, not with hurt. She had been invisible long enough that the step from invisible to actively sidestepped was not as large as it might have been, but with the careful attention of a person who understands that information about how a system treats you is itself useful information about the system. She did not tell Caspian, not because she was keeping it from him, but because it was not yet his problem to solve. She was in the palace for 2 more weeks, before they would travel to the Voss seat, and the people making her life quietly inconvenient were not people she needed to have resolved for her. They were people she needed to understand. She went to the library instead of certain dinner tables. She read instead of attending certain afternoon gatherings. She learned, in those 2 weeks, more about the structure and management of the Voss duchy than anyone in the court suspected she knew, because no one had thought to wonder what she was doing with her time. Hartwell came to see her 3 days before the wedding. He knocked, was invited in, stood correctly at the right distance from her desk, with his hands folded in the specific posture of a professional, about to say something he is unsure of the reception to. He said, "The Duke asked me to inform you that the corrections to the land register have been submitted to the Crown Land Office. The surveyor will arrive at the Holt tributary in the 3rd week of next month." She said, "Good." Hartwell said, "The filing you wrote was received without amendment." She said, "It was correct." Hartwell said, "Yes, It was. He stood there for a moment. She looked at him. He said, "My lady, I have been in service to the Voss estate for 14 years. I want you to know that what you found in those records, the error was significant, and the filing was exactly right, and in 14 years, no one has done either of those things." She said, "Someone should have read it more carefully before." Hartwell said, "Yes, my lady." She said, "I am not criticizing. I am observing that the reading of records is often assigned low priority because it is not visible work. It should be higher priority." Hartwell said, "I agree." She said, "Good. Then we agree. I will need the past 3 years of maintenance contracts reviewed when we arrive at the seat. There is a pattern in the road repair allocations that I want to examine." Hartwell said, "I will have them ready." He left. She went back to her work. The wedding was 4 days away, and she had a list, and the list was not going to work through itself. The morning of the wedding was cold in the specific clear way of late autumn, when the air has not yet turned bitter, but has the quality of glass, sharp and transparent and carrying sound a long way. She stood in the window of her room, at the Prentice Apartments, while her hair was being dressed by Lady Prentice's maid, who was excellent at her work, and who was doing it with the contained and serious focus of someone performing an important task. Lady Prentice was in the chair by the fire, not pretending to do anything other than watching. She said, "Are you ready?" Marin said, "For the wedding?" Lady Prentice said, "For the rest of it." Marin looked at the city through the window. The rooftops, the thin smoke from morning fires, the sky that was such a clear and particular shade of blue that it did not look like weather but like a decision. She said, "I have read 3 volumes of land registry records, 18 months of river crossing reports, 3 years of maintenance contracts, and every letter of correspondence in the estate files that Hartwell could pull without requiring special authority. I have a list of 11 things that need addressing in the first month. I have written to Lady Norville about the drainage amendment. I have asked Hartwell to prepare a review schedule for the road contracts." Lady Prentice said, "That is not what I asked." Marin looked at the window. She said, "I know." The maid placed the last pin and stepped back. Lady Prentice looked at Marin the way she had looked at her for 3 years, clearly, without flattery, with the genuine attention of someone who has been paying real interest in another person's development and is taking stock. She said, "You are going to be excellent at the work." Marin said, "Yes." Lady Prentice said, "The rest is harder." Marin said, "I know." She turned from the window. She said, "But I am going toward it, not away from it. That is the most honest thing I can tell you." Lady Prentice looked at her for a long moment. She said, "It is the right thing." They went to the wedding. The ceremony itself was not long. This was, she understood later, a reflection of Caspian's specific preferences. He had told the officiating clergyman, in the direct and slightly alarming way he told people things, that the ceremony should contain the essential words and nothing additional, because a ceremony that says what it needs to say in 30 minutes has not lost anything by declining to take an hour. The clergyman had agreed with the careful agreement of a man who understands he is not being asked. She stood at the front of the chapel beside him and said the words she was required to say, and heard him say his. His voice was even. He was looking at her, not at the room behind her, and she understood from the quality of his attention that this was not a performance. He was not looking at her because it was the expected thing to do, but because she was the person he was talking to, and he was, as he always was, paying attention to what was actually in front of him. She looked back. She said the words. He said the words. The clergyman said the closing words, and the chapel, which contained the king and a selected and rather small number of the court. Caspian had been precise about the guest list, and she had, when asked, added only Lady Prentice and Lady Norville, made the sounds that chapels make at the conclusion of a ceremony. Lady Prentice, in the 3rd row, was not crying, because Lady Prentice did not cry at public occasions, but there was something in her face when Marin glanced at her, something that was close to pride, and had the specific quality of a feeling that has been paid for honestly over time. Outside the chapel, in the cold, clear air of the late autumn morning, Caspian stood beside her and said, very quietly, so that no one else could hear, "You look very calm." She said, "I am calm." he said. Most people are not, at this particular moment. She said, I have been reading the maintenance contracts. I know what the next 3 months look like. It is much calmer than you might expect. He looked at her. Something in his face did the thing she had come to recognize, the slight, real adjustment that was not a performance, but simply the evidence of a person actually responding to the moment they were in. He said, 3 months. She said, there is a pattern in the road repair allocations between the eastern farms and the main road junction that suggests either a geographic prioritization error or something less innocent. I want to know which. He said, it is a geographic prioritization error. I have suspected it for 2 years. She said, why have you not corrected it? He said, because I did not have a complete picture of the maintenance contract history. I have been working from reports rather than the contracts themselves. She said, Hartwell is pulling the contracts. I will have the complete picture in the first week. He said, I know. He told me. She said, and? He said, and I am looking forward to knowing what the first week produces. It was not a romantic thing to say. It was not dressed in warmth or gesture. It was simply true, in the specific way that things Caspian said were simply true. And she received it as such and felt, in the cold morning air outside the chapel, something that was not quite warmth, and was not quite satisfaction, but was somewhere in the region of both, the feeling of having confirmed something she had suspected, without quite being able to verify. They were going in the same direction, not because they had been told to, because the direction itself made sense to both of them, and they had each, independently, and for different reasons that turned out to be the same reason, arrived at the same point. The horses were brought around for the journey north. She had her documents in the saddlebag. He had his. They left the city before noon. The journey to the Voss seat took 4 days, through country that changed gradually, from the flat farmland surrounding the capital to the hillier, more forested terrain of the northern interior. The roads were good, better than the maintenance records had suggested they would be, which was either a sign that the records were inaccurate or that recent repairs had not yet been entered into the reports, and she intended to find out which. She spent the first night at a way station, where the rooms were clean and the food was what food at way stations is, adequate, served without ceremony, better hot than cold. She ate at the common table, because the alternative was a private room, and privacy at way stations generally produced food that had been sitting longer. Caspian ate at the same table. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. She had noticed, by this point, that Caspian's silences were not the silences of someone who had run out of things to say, or who was strategically withholding. They were the silences of a person who was thinking, and did not see the need to fill the space between thoughts with sounds. She was the same way. She had been told, at various points in her life, that this made her difficult to be around. She had found, in her recent experience, that it made her easy to be around for the specific category of person who also thought this way. At some point during the second day of travel, when they were on the long ridge road that gave a clear view of the valley below and the scattered farms that dotted it, she asked him about the eastern farms. He told her. He told her in the precise and well-organized way of a person who has been thinking about a problem for a long time and has a great deal of information about it, and who is also, possibly for the first time, talking to someone who will understand both the information and the problem without needing either translated. She asked questions, good questions, the kind that take the information he is giving and test it against what it implies, rather than simply absorbing it. He answered them. They were, somewhere in the middle of the second day of that journey, having the first real working conversation of their marriage, about road maintenance and farm access, and the political dynamics of a stretch of land they were both, in different ways, now responsible for. It was not a love story, at this point. It was something more durable than that. It was two people discovering, on a ridge road on a cold afternoon in the northern country, that their minds worked in a way that was compatible not just in preference, but in the specific, technical, and entirely practical sense of being able to think alongside each other, without losing anything in translation. She looked at the valley below and thought, I can do something here. She had not thought that about a place in 3 years. The Voss seat came into view on the afternoon of the 4th day. It was large, as she had known it would be from the records, but records are not the same as seeing, and seeing it from the last hill on the approach road, the long stone building, the older tower at its eastern end, the farmland stretching out on three sides, the river visible as a thread of reflected light to the north, produced a feeling that was different from the feeling of reading about a place and knowing its dimensions. She pulled her horse up on the crest of the hill and looked at it. Caspian came up beside her and stopped. He did not say anything. He had been managing these roads and these fields and the people on them for 3 years, and the sight of it was not new to him, but he sat beside her on the hill and waited while she looked, and she understood that the waiting was deliberate, that he was giving her the time to see it properly. She looked for a long time. She said, "The drainage on the south field is wrong." He said, "I know." She said, "The furrow patterns are running parallel to the slope instead of across it. They have been losing topsoil every wet season." He said, "The man who managed the south field for 12 years retired 2 years ago, and his replacement has not yet corrected his habits." She said, "I will put it on the list." He said, "How long is the list now?" She said, 13 items. He said, "And we have not yet entered the building." She looked at the valley. She looked at the river. She looked at the long stone house with the old tower, and the south field with its wrong furrows, and the north track with its uneven surface. That she could see from here was the consequence of poor drainage in the ditch alongside it. She said, "Let's go." They went down the hill toward the house that was, as of that morning, also her house, and the people who came out to meet them were the people she was now, at least in part, responsible for, and the work was already there, real and present and requiring attention. She rode in with her back straight and her mind already moving 3 items ahead on the list. She was, she realized, entirely at home. The Voss seat had 31 rooms that were in regular use and 11 more that were not. A kitchen that had been producing excellent food for longer than any of the current kitchen staff had been alive. A stable that held 20 horses and smelled appropriately of horses. A library that was smaller than the palace library but considerably better organized. And a problem. The problem was not immediately obvious. It never was, in places that had been managed by the same set of hands for a long time. The surface of the estate was orderly, clean, functional, staffed by people who knew their work and did it well. The deeper structure was something else. Marin knew this the way she knew it about Lady Prentice's estate in the first weeks, not from visible evidence, but from the particular quality of smoothness that things have when they have been managed for appearance rather than for substance. She spent the first 3 days simply moving through the estate, not inspecting, not interrogating, moving, walking the kitchen passage at the times it was most occupied, sitting in the estate office while Hartwell went through the morning correspondence, walking the south field with the replacement field manager, whose name was Dent and who was 38 and capable and had been doing things the way the previous manager had done them, because no one had told him not to, riding the north track, sitting with the household accounts at the desk in the room that had been assigned to her as a working space, a good room, with north-facing windows that meant consistent light through the day, that Caspian had arranged without being asked. At the end of the 3rd day, she had 9 new items on the list, and a clearer picture. The picture was this: the Voss estate was fundamentally sound, the land was good, the staff was capable, the finances were stable. What had been happening for approximately the past 2.5 years was a slow, almost invisible narrowing, a pattern of deferred decisions, minor neglect of long-term maintenance in favor of short-term presentability, and a set of contracted arrangements that had been renewed automatically and expensively when they could have been renegotiated at better terms. She thought, this is what happens when one person is running everything, and also fighting a grief they will not name. She did not say this to Caspian. It was not information he needed from her. It was information she needed for herself, to understand the shape of what she was looking at. She said instead, "I want to talk about the contracted arrangements." They were in the estate office, in the evening, after the staff had gone. Caspian was at the larger desk, reviewing the week's correspondence. She was at the small table by the window, with 3 contracts open in front of her. He said, "Which ones?" She said, "The grain supply contract, the timber agreement with the Pelwick Yard, and the road maintenance contract with the county works office." He said, "Tell me." She laid out what she had found. She was precise and not dramatic about it. The grain contract had been renewed 18 months ago, at a rate that was 12% above the current market, and the market had dropped because of a good harvest year, and the contract could be renegotiated now with a month's notice. The Pelwick Timber Agreement was costing them for a volume of timber they had not used in 2 years, because 2 years ago, a decision had been made to source emergency repairs from a closer yard, and the main contract had never been adjusted. The road maintenance contract was more complicated. It was structured in a way that paid for hours of labor rather than outcomes, which meant that the work expanded to fill the contracted time, regardless of whether the work was necessary. He listened without interrupting. This was one of the things she had noticed about him. He was genuinely listening, not waiting for a pause to respond. He tracked the information she was giving him, and she could see it being processed, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was integrating information, rather than performing patience. He said, "The grain contract, how much did you estimate the overpayment at?" She said, 480 gold per year at current rates, assuming rates hold. They may drop further before next spring. He said, "And the Pelwick timber?" She said, "That one depends on whether we can establish what our actual timber needs are for the next 2 years. If we can establish that, I can renegotiate on volume rather than rate, and save approximately a third of the current cost." He said, "We can establish it. Hartwell has the maintenance schedule." She said, "I need the actual schedule, not the planned schedule." Planned and actual diverged about 14 months ago. He looked at her. He said, "You found that in 3 days." She said, "It was in the records. The records are complete. They just need reading." He said, "I have not been reading them as carefully as I should." She said, "You have been doing everything. No one reads carefully when they are doing everything." He said nothing for a moment. He said, "The road maintenance contract is the most difficult one." She said, "Yes, switching to outcome-based contracting requires a new agreement and a period during which we establish baseline metrics. It will take longer than the other two. But the current structure is paying for about 30% more labor than the outcomes justify." He said, "I know. I have known for approximately 18 months." She said, "And?" He said, "I had not found the time to address it properly, and I was unwilling to address it improperly." She said, "Then address it properly now. I will draft the new structure if you tell me the outcomes you want." He looked at her across the office, in the evening light that was coming in sideways through the western window and landing on the surface of the desk between them, in a way that turned the papers gold. He said, "You are very good at this." She said, "I know." She said it without vanity and without deflection. She had learned over 3 years in Lady Prentice's service that the specific skill of pretending to be less capable than you were, in order to make other people more comfortable, was a skill that benefited other people at your own expense, and she had stopped paying that particular price. He said, "I am glad you know." She said, "I need to know what outcomes you want for the road maintenance, and I need the actual maintenance schedule from Hartwell, and then I can draft the new contract framework this week." He said, "You can have both tomorrow morning." She said, "Good." She began organizing the 3 contracts back into order. He watched her for a moment, and then went back to his correspondence, and the office was quiet, in the specific way of 2 people working together in the same space, not speaking, not needing to speak, but both present and both moving forward. It was a small thing. It was, from the outside, completely unremarkable, but Marin, who had spent 3 years doing this same kind of work for someone else's household without credit or consequence, knew exactly what it felt like when the work she was doing was actually going somewhere. Dent brought the Southfield drainage report the following morning, on her request, and she spent an hour with him at the kitchen table going through the furrow maps. He was, as she had suspected, a careful farmer who had been following wrong instructions. He understood the drainage issue immediately when she drew it out. He said he had thought the parallel furrows seemed incorrect, but had not wanted to change the established pattern without authority. She said, "You have the authority now. What do you need to correct it?" He said, 2 weeks of work with the team and the use of the clay tile drainage kit that is in the equipment store." She said, "The kit that has been in the equipment store for 8 months?" He said, "Yes, my lady. It was ordered before I arrived." She said, "Then use it." Bring me the revised furrow plan before you begin so I can confirm the approach. He brought it the next day. She confirmed it. The work began. In the third week, she received a letter from Lady Norville. It was addressed to her directly, as she had requested, not to the estate office or to Caspian. It contained 3 questions about the Aldenmere Creek drainage amendment and 2 observations about the spring water levels that would need to be factored into any formal agreement. She read the letter twice, wrote a draft reply, revised it, and sent the final version the same afternoon. At dinner that evening, they ate together when neither had conflicting obligations, which was most evenings, at the long table in the small dining room rather than the formal one. Caspian asked about the reply to Norville. She said, "I sent it this afternoon. I proposed a joint assessment of the drainage situation in the first week of spring, with an agreement in principle about the cost-sharing structure, before the assessment happens, so that the assessment is not delayed by disagreement about costs." He said, "You proposed that in the reply?" She said, "A preliminary structure. She will adjust it. We will agree." He said, "You are confident about that?" She said, "She is a practical woman. I am also a practical woman. Practical people generally agree faster than anyone else." He looked at her. He said, "I wrote to the Norville estate 3 times in the past 2 years about the drainage matter. We did not agree in any of those letters." She said, "You were writing to her husband." A pause. He said, "Yes." The burrito was cold, Anvil. She said, "Lord Norville and you are apparently very similar people who have very similar ideas about how a negotiation should proceed, and very different ideas about where the starting position should be. I am not similar to either of you in approach. Lady Norville is not similar to either of you either. We will agree." He considered this for a moment. He said, "I think you are right." She said, "I know I am right. We will see in 3 weeks when she replies." Lady Norville replied in 2 weeks. The preliminary structure was accepted with 2 modifications, both of which Marin had anticipated, and one of which she had left out of the original, deliberately so that Lady Norville would have something to adjust, because giving a practical person something to fix makes them feel appropriately involved in the solution. She read the reply at her desk in the north-facing office. She did not feel triumphant. She felt satisfied, which was different. Satisfaction was the feeling of a thing working the way it was supposed to, the specific click of a mechanism engaging correctly. She put Lady Norville's letter in the correspondence file and turned to the road maintenance contract draft. There was always another piece of work. This did not trouble her. It never had. The grain contract renegotiation was handled by correspondence over 10 days, with 3 letters exchanged, and the final agreement arriving on a Thursday morning. Marin read it, checked it against the draft she had prepared, confirmed it was correct, and sent the acknowledgement before lunch. The new rate saved the estate 410 gold per year, slightly less than her estimate, because the market had shifted marginally in the intervening weeks, but close enough to confirm the method. Hartwell brought her the signed copy with the expression of a man who has revised his expectations upward twice in the same month. He said, "The grain supplier expressed some surprise at the approach." She said, "What kind of surprise?" He said, the previous correspondence on contract matters was generally less, his word, specific." She said, "Less specific." Hartwell said, and I am quoting him here, that the new letter read as though it had been written by someone who knew what they were talking about. She said, "Good. That was the intention." Hartwell allowed himself, very briefly, the shadow of a smile. He said, "Will there be anything else this morning, my lady?" She said, "The Pelwick timber account. Has the actual usage report come from the yard?" He said, "It arrived yesterday. I left it on your reading stack." She said, "I will look at it this afternoon." He said, "Of course, my lady." He left. She was beginning to understand Hartwell. He was a man of precise competence in a narrow range, and within that range he was excellent. Outside it, anything involving the kind of strategic thinking that required seeing the difference between what the records said and what the records meant, he was less sure. He was learning, she thought, to trust her judgment on those things, not because she had asked him to, but because the results had been consistently accurate, and Hartwell was a practical man who trusted what worked. She also understood that he had loved the Voss estate in the specific way that a person who has given long years to something loves it. Not with the love of ownership, but with the love of responsibility, the attachment of someone who has kept a thing going through difficult periods and is proud of that fact, even when they cannot show it openly. She did not threaten that. She had no interest in replacing what he did well. She was interested in the parts that were not being done well, and in doing them, and in the estate being better for it. She thought this was a reasonable arrangement. So far, the evidence suggested Hartwell thought so too. The evenings were the part of the new life that she had thought least about before she arrived in it, because evenings were harder to plan for than mornings. Mornings had work. Evenings had what was left after work, and what was left after work when you were two people who had known each other for 6 weeks before a marriage was a question that did not have an obvious answer. They mostly read. They had, without discussing it, arranged the habit organically, dinner. And then the small sitting room off the library, where there was a good fire, and 2 adequate chairs and sufficient light. And they read their separate books, and occasionally said something, and occasionally did not, and the evening passed in a way that was, she thought, almost shockingly comfortable, given that it had been about 3 weeks since they met. One evening in the 4th week, she said, "What are you reading?" He said, "A history of the Aldenmere Valley from the 16th century. There is a chapter on the drainage patterns that predates the current system. I thought it might be relevant." She said, "To the Norville Agreement?" He said, "To the underlying problem the Norville Agreement is trying to solve. The creek was managed differently before the current diversion, and the original management was apparently more effective." She said, "Can I see it when you finish the chapter?" He said, "I will mark it." He marked it. She read it 2 days later. It was relevant. She added a clause to the agreement framework on the basis of what she had read, and Lady Norville's subsequent letter referred to the clause with the specific approval of a woman who has been thinking about a problem for a long time and has just been handed a piece of information that changes the structure of it. Marin showed Caspian the letter. He read the relevant section. He looked at the clause she had added. He said, "That came from the 16th century drainage chapter." She said, "Yes." He said, "I read that book a year ago and did not apply it to the Norville problem." She said, "You were reading it for a different reason." He said, "What reason were you reading it for?" She said, "I was reading it because you had marked it for me. But I saw the application to the Norville problem because I was already thinking about the spring water levels and the clay composition of the creek bank, and the chapter on the original drainage management spoke directly to both." He looked at the letter. He looked at her. He said, "You hold a great many threads at the same time." She said, "I always have. It was less useful when the threads were Lady Prentice's." He said, "It is very useful now." She said, "Yes." They were both quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the winter had properly arrived. The grounds were frozen. The road to the north field was solid under a light covering of snow. The river was still moving, but would not be moving much longer. She said, "The south field drainage work is almost finished. Dent says it will be completed before the hard freeze." He said, "Good." She said, "It should have been done 2 years ago." He said, "Yes, it should have." He said it without defensiveness, without the particular quality that people attach to admitted failures when they are not truly ready to admit them, the faint undercurrent of excuse, the suggestion that the circumstances made the failing understandable. He said it plainly, as a fact, the way he said most things. She respected that. She always had, since the gallery corridor, since the library, since the first conversation about wanting and readiness, and the failure of waiting for the right time. He was not a person who said things in order to appear a certain way. He said them because they were true, and truth, to him, was a more fundamental value than impression. She said, "We are not going to be able to recover the 2 years." He said, "No." She said, "But the field will drain correctly next spring." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the grain contract will cost us less." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the Norville Drainage Amendment will be formalized by summer." He said, "Yes." She looked at the window and the dark outside it, and the snow that was falling now in the slow and deliberate way of snow that intends to stay. She said, "The list is shorter than it was." He said, "How much shorter?" She said, 22 items addressed, 14 remaining." He said, "And by spring?" She said, 8. If the road contract is agreed before the thaw and the Pelwick timber situation resolves cleanly." He said, "It will. The Pelwick yard owner is a practical man." She said, "I know. I have been writing to him." He looked at her. She said, "I told you I would handle the Pelwick account." He said, "I know you told me. I was surprised to find that you already had." She said, "I do not tell people things I do not intend to follow through on." He said, "I am aware." He said it with the quiet certainty of someone who has been watching a pattern long enough to have confirmed it. And in that certainty, in the simple, evidenced acknowledgement of who she was and what she did, was something that she recognized as more valuable than any of the warmth that she had not yet fully felt, or fully examined, or fully allowed herself. She had been seen. Not performed for, not managed toward, not presented with, seen. She went back to her book. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The first letter arrived in the 3rd month. It was from a woman named Lady Croft, who was the wife of a baron with a small estate approximately 50 miles from the Voss seat, and who managed, within the social structure of the northern nobility, a position of some informal influence, the kind of influence that comes not from land or title, but from having spent 20 years as the person others consulted, and from having cultivated, over those years, a network of correspondences that gave her an accurate picture of what was happening across a considerable portion of the northern territory. The letter was addressed to Caspian. It was about a land matter involving a contested fence line between 2 smaller estates near the Croft property. It was, on its surface, a perfectly routine request for a ducal opinion on a minor dispute. Under the surface, and Marin read it 3 times before she was satisfied with her reading of it, it was something else. Lady Croft had addressed it to Caspian, rather than to the Voss estate office. She had used the specific phrasing that suggests personal correspondence, rather than official correspondence. She had, in the 3rd paragraph, referred to a dinner the previous autumn, before the betrothal announcement, at which apparently some discussion of northern boundary management had taken place. She had concluded with a line that said, with elegant indirection, that she looked forward to continuing the dialogue they had begun, and that she hoped the recent changes at the Voss seat had not disrupted the Duke's availability for such discussions. She said, that evening, to Caspian, "I read the Croft letter." He said, "I expected you would." She said, "She is asking whether the recent changes have reduced your independence." He said, "Yes." She said, "By recent changes, she means me." He said, "Yes." She said, "She is not asking directly." He said, "She never asks directly." She looked at the letter, which was on the desk between them. She said, "How long has she been an informal influence in this region?" He said, "Approximately 15 years. She is thorough, she is connected, and she genuinely understands the land matters she involves herself in, which is rarer than it sounds." She said, "Do you respect her?" He said, "I respect her competence. I do not always agree with her conclusions." She said, "But you have been in correspondence with her." He said, "Yes, on matters that affect the duchy." She said, "And she has been useful." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then write back. Tell her the fence line question is a boundary management issue that falls within the scope of my remit, and that she should direct future correspondence on such matters to me directly." He looked at her. She said, "If she is useful, I would rather have access to her network than not have it. And if she is going to form an opinion about whether the recent changes have limited your independence, it is better for her to form it by writing to me than by writing to you and watching you not write back." He said, "That is exactly right." She said, "I know." He said, "Shall I write it, or will you?" She said, "Write it. It should come from you. Introduce me by name and by remit. After that, the correspondence is mine." Lady Croft's reply came in 10 days. It was addressed to Marin. It was, she noted, considerably more direct than the original letter to Caspian, an adjustment that told her several things about Lady Croft, all of them interesting. The fence line question, as it turned out, was not simple. The contested line ran through a section of low-lying ground that had been subject to a drainage improvement 20 years ago, and the improvement had shifted the actual physical boundary by approximately 12 feet without any update to the original survey. Both estates believed they were correct. Both were, on the basis of different documents, demonstrably right. She wrote back a letter that proposed, very simply, that the solution was a new survey conducted at shared expense, and that the existing documents on both sides be treated as historically accurate records of the boundary at the time they were created, and that the new survey establish the current correct position. She also noted, in the fourth paragraph, that the drainage improvement from 20 years ago had been documented in the county records, under the name of the County Works Office, and that there might be a case for the county office to bear some or all of the survey cost, on the grounds that the improvement was their work, and the ambiguity was their consequence. Lady Croft replied 4 days later. She said she had not known the drainage improvement was in the county records. She said the county cost argument was, in her view, correct and well constructed. She said she would pursue it and advise. 2 weeks later, Lady Croft wrote again to say that the county office had agreed to bear the full cost of the new survey, and that both estate owners had accepted the arrangement, and that she would be grateful if Marin had any further availability for consultation on similar matters. Marin wrote back that she did. The network opened, not all at once, nothing important opens all at once, but steadily, in the way that a correspondence grows when the people involved are useful to each other. By the end of the winter, she was in regular contact with 11 people across the Northern Territory, 7 of whom she had never met, and all of whom were finding the new Duchess of Voss considerably more useful to write to than they had expected. None of them had expected much. This was fine. She had never required other people's expectations to calibrate what she was capable of. There was one exception. His name was Lord Farwell, and he was the largest landowner in the Northern Territory after the Voss estate itself, and he had been managing his interests in the north for 30 years, with the particular confidence of a man who has been the most significant person in a room for so long that it has become, in his mind, simply the natural order of things. He did not write to her. He wrote to Caspian. He wrote, in the month after the letters from Lady Croft had established Marin's role in the correspondence of the territory, a letter that was pleasant and professional, and that made no reference to Marin at all, not even in the polite and formalized way that correspondence of that period was supposed to acknowledge a man's wife. She read the letter. She said nothing about it. Caspian said, "Farewell." She said, "Yes." He said, "He has ignored the introduction." She said, "Yes." He said, "I can write back and insist on the acknowledgement." She said, "Not yet." He said, "When?" She said, "When it becomes relevant to something he actually needs. At that point the oversight becomes a problem for him, rather than an insult to me, and the correction is practical, rather than principled." He looked at her. He said, "You are very patient about this." She said, "I am strategic about this. They are not the same thing." He said, "What is the difference?" She said, "Patience is the willingness to wait. Strategy is knowing what you are waiting for." He said, "And what are you waiting for?" She said, "Farwell has a water rights dispute with 2 estates to his north. It has been ongoing for 4 years. At some point it will become acute, and when it does, the most efficient resolution will require someone with the specific knowledge of northern water management law and the existing county agreements that I have spent the past 3 months acquiring." He said, "And at that point he will need to write to you." She said, "At that point, it will be genuinely easier to write to me than not to write to me, and the practical ease of that will do what a principled correction cannot. It will make the acknowledgement natural rather than forced." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You are better at this than I am." She said, "I have been practicing invisibility since I was 9 years old. It teaches you a great deal about how people make choices when they think no one is watching." He said nothing for a moment, and she understood that the sentence had landed somewhere, not painfully, because she had not said it to cause pain, but with the specific weight of information that changes the shape of something. He said, "Was it very difficult?" She said, "Which part?" He said, "All of it, being the 3rd daughter, losing the estate, The years before Lady Prentice. She looked at the desk. She looked at the correspondence. She said, "It was the most instructive period of my life." He said, "That is not the same as saying it was not difficult." She said, "No, it is not." She picked up the next letter from the reading stack. He watched her for a moment, and then he picked up his own correspondence, and the office was quiet again, in the good and working way that they had established in the first weeks. But somewhere in the quality of the quiet, something had shifted, a degree or two in the direction of the honest, the way a compass adjusts when you carry it closer to true north. They worked until evening. She did not say anything else about the difficult years, but she had said something, and it had been true, and he had heard it, and that was enough for now. The rest of it, she thought, would come when it came. She was in no hurry. She was, after all, a strategic person. Farwell's water rights problem became acute in early spring. She knew it would, because she had been watching the county water records since January, and could see the pattern. 2 estates upstream of Farwell had expanded their irrigation in the previous growing season, and the expansion had been filed correctly with the county office, but had not been communicated to Farwell's estate manager, and the first warm weeks of the year would reveal the gap between what Farwell expected and what was actually available. The letter arrived in the second week of the thaw. It was addressed to Caspian. Caspian brought it to her without comment and set it on her reading stack. She read it. Then she wrote a reply in Caspian's name. She did this occasionally, at his request, for correspondence in his domain that she had more direct knowledge of than he did, that was businesslike and helpful, and contained, in its second paragraph, a reference to the county water records from the previous season, and the specific filing that Farwell would need to find if he intended to challenge the upstream expansion legally. She did not sign her name. The letter went out under Caspian's seal. Farwell replied in 5 days, and the reply was to Caspian, and it said that the reference to the county water records had been extremely useful and that he would like to discuss the matter further when convenient. Caspian wrote back. The letter was brief. It said that his wife, Lady Maren Voss, had identified the relevant records and had a more complete grasp of the county water management situation than he did, and that if Lord Farwell wished to pursue the matter, he should direct his correspondence to her. She read this letter before it went out. She said, "You did not have to do that." He said, "I know. You had a strategy." She said, "The strategy was working." He said, "Your strategy required you to remain invisible to a man who was already aware that you exist. My version requires you to be visible to him on your own terms." She said, "Your version might make him resistant." He said, "If his resistance to being corrected is stronger than his need to solve his water problem, then he was never going to be useful anyway." She looked at him. He said, "And if he is the practical man his reputation suggests, he will want the solution more than he wants the principle." She said, "How confident are you?" He said, 70%. She said, "Those are not good odds." He said, "They are not bad ones either." Farwell's reply came in 3 days, not 5. It was addressed to Lady Maren Voss. It was correct in form and respectful in tone, and contained 4 specific questions about the water rights situation that were good questions, the kind of questions a person asks when they have moved past the posturing stage of a problem and are ready to solve it. She answered them, all 4, with precision and with the complete county records appended. He wrote back the same week. The correspondence became a working exchange over the following month, and the water rights dispute was resolved through a negotiated sharing agreement that Maren drafted, Lady Norville helped review, and both upstream estates and Farwell ultimately signed. At the end of that month, she received a letter from Farwell that contained, in its final paragraph, a sentence that said, "I want to say plainly that the approach to the water rights problem was not what I expected, and that it was considerably better than what I expected. I look forward to our continued correspondence." She read the sentence twice. She read it not for what it said. She had expected the acknowledgement when the problem was resolved, but for the specific quality of it. He had said plainly. He had not said in retrospect or upon reflection, or any of the other phrasings that people use when they are admitting something they wish they did not have to admit. He had said plainly, which was the word you use when you are choosing directness as a deliberate action, rather than having it forced on you. She respected that. She wrote back with equal plainness and filed the letter in the Farwell correspondence folder, which was by this point thick with relevant documents. The network, by the end of that spring, included 16 correspondents. 3 of them were women, who managed their household's external affairs directly. 5 of them had sent requests that she had referred to Caspian because they fell within his specific domain rather than hers. 2 of them had sent problems she had solved so quickly that she suspected they had been expecting the problems to languish and had been mildly astonished when they didn't. She sent Lady Prentice a long letter at the end of the spring, the first really long one since the winter. It covered the water rights case, the Norville agreement, the grain contract, the road maintenance restructure, and the Farwell situation in full, including the letter where he said plainly. Lady Prentice's reply was, for once, also long. It said, "I have been telling people for 3 years that you were exceptional. I was telling the wrong people. I am glad the right ones are finding out for themselves." It said, "Farwell's letter is a greater compliment than he knows. Men of his type use the word plainly only when they mean it. Keep that one." She kept it. She put it in the drawer with Lady Prentice's other letters, which she had carried from the capital in a cloth folder, and which had traveled in her saddlebag on the 4-day journey north, and which lived, now, in the upper left drawer of the desk in the north-facing office. The desk had been in the office when she arrived. She did not know who had used it before. It was solid and old, and the surface was marked with the faint evidence of long use. The rings from cups, the impression of writing that had been pressed hard. She had said, to Hartwell, in the first week, that she liked the desk and intended to keep it, and Hartwell had looked at it as though he had never quite looked at it before, the way a person looks at something familiar when someone else points out that it is actually rather good. She looked at the desk now, in the spring light, with the window open for the first time since November, and the correspondence files spread across it, and Lady Prentice's letter in the drawer. She thought, "This is the most useful I have been in my adult life." She thought, "No, that is not quite right." She thought, "This is the first time the usefulness has been mine." That distinction was not a small one. Outside, the south field was draining correctly for the first time in several seasons, and the furrows ran across the slope the way they were supposed to, and the spring rain was going where it was supposed to go, and none of the people responsible for the field were aware of how significant this was, which was exactly how it should be when something works. It disappears into normal, into expected, into simply the way things are. She was not looking for credit. She was looking at the list on her desk, which had 7 items on it, down from 22. She picked up her pen. She crossed off the one they had finished yesterday. 6 items. She turned to the next one. The annual meeting of the Northern Territory landowners was held in the second month of summer, at a rotating estate, and that year the rotation had landed on the Voss seat, which meant that 34 people arrived over the course of 2 days, and needed housing and feeding, and a meeting room that actually functioned. And Marin was the one who made sure all of it happened correctly, because she had made sure all of it happened correctly from the planning stage 4 months earlier. She had also prepared a presentation of the water rights framework she had developed for the Farwell situation, because during the course of the spring correspondence, she had realized that the Farwell problem was not unique to Farwell. It was a version of a problem that existed across the Northern Territory, wherever irrigation had expanded, without adequate communication between adjacent landowners and the county office, and the framework she had built for Farwell could be adapted and applied more broadly. She had not told Caspian about the presentation until the week before the meeting. He had looked at the materials. He had read them carefully. He had asked 3 questions, all of them good. He had said, "Do you want me to introduce it, or will you present it yourself?" She said, "I will present it." He said, "Some of them will resist receiving it from you directly." She said, "Some of them will. They will change their minds when they see the content." He said, "How long have you been working on this?" She said, "I began the framework in January. The presentation materials took 2 weeks." He said, "In January you had been here for 6 weeks." She said, "I could see the pattern in January. It was not going to stop being a pattern by waiting." He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand, as the one he had when he was updating his understanding of something. He said, "I want you to know something." She waited. He said, "In the 3 years before you arrived, I have had approximately a dozen conversations with colleagues and advisors about the territory's water management. None of them identified what you identified in January, she said. They were not reading the same documents. He said, they had access to the same documents. She said, access is not the same as reading. He said, no, it is not. He looked at the presentation materials again, and then he looked at her. And in the quality of that looking was something that was beyond acknowledgement, something that was closer to the recognition of a person who has encountered something they did not know they needed until it was in front of them. She did not name it. It was not time to name it. She said, the meeting starts at the 9th hour. I need the main room arranged in the workshop format, not the dining format. Can you tell Hartwell? He said, I already told him. She said, good. She went back to the materials. The presentation took 40 minutes. She delivered it without notes because she had written it and revised it and knew every number in it from the source, and speaking without notes to a room of 34 people who were in various states of skepticism about her, gave her the specific advantage of being able to watch them without looking away from a page. She watched them change. Not all of them, not uniformly, but in the arc of 40 minutes, the room moved from polite attention to genuine interest, to, in several cases, the slightly reluctant leaning forward of people who are being shown something they did not bring, and are finding it better than they would have predicted. Farwell, who was in the third row, asked the first question when she opened the floor. He asked it directly, and it was a good question. She answered it precisely. 2 other people asked follow-up questions. She answered those. By the end of the discussion period, the framework had been accepted as a working proposal to be submitted to the county office for formalization, with 3 landowners volunteering to sponsor the submission. Lady Norville was one of them. Lord Farwell was one of them. The third was a man she had not previously corresponded with, a younger landowner named Lord Graves, who had inherited his estate the previous year, and who had spent the meeting with the expression of someone who is the newest person in a room, and is trying to learn faster than the room expects him to. He came to her afterward. He said, the framework is excellent. I would like to know whether the approach can be applied to the road access problem in the Eastern Corridor. She said, sit down and tell me about the road access problem in the Eastern Corridor. He sat down, he told her. It took 20 minutes, and it was, as she had suspected it would be, a version of a problem she already had a partial framework for. She said, give me 2 weeks. I will write to you. He said, thank you, Lady Voss. She noted that he used the name without the slight pause that some people put before it, the pause that meant they were deciding whether to acknowledge it, rather than simply acknowledging it. He said it the way you say the name of a person you have decided to take seriously, which was the only way she had any interest in being addressed. She went back to Caspian afterward, and found him at the edge of the room talking to Farwell, and Farwell was talking with the specific animation of a man who has been impressed and is comfortable enough to show it to the person most responsible. He saw her come in. He said, Lady Voss, I want to say again, the county records element alone was worth the entire framework. I have been disputing water access for 4 years, and no one ever thought to look at the filing records. She said, most people look for the problem in the dispute. It is usually in the documentation. Farwell said, that is an extraordinarily useful thing to know. She said, it is obvious once you know where to look. He said, most useful things are. He went back to Caspian, and she went to find Hartwell to review the afternoon schedule, and the meeting continued, and the framework moved toward formalization, and the summer was long, and the list on her desk was down to 4 items by the time the last guest left. She crossed off a 5th item that evening, because the meeting had resolved something she had been waiting for. 3 items. She sat at the desk in the long summer light and looked at them. She thought, by autumn. She thought, maybe sooner. She turned off the lamp and went to dinner. The thing she had not fully prepared for was the capital. They returned in the autumn for the seasonal court, which was a requirement attached to the ducal title, not a frequent requirement, 2 months in the autumn and 6 weeks in the spring, but a requirement nonetheless, and the palace was exactly as she had left it, except that she was not the same person who had left it. She understood this immediately when they arrived, in the way you understand something that has been true for a while, but that you needed the perspective of return to see clearly. The court was operating on its familiar and elaborate logic, and she was no longer navigating it from the position of invisible third daughter with no resources, which was the position she had navigated it from for 6 years. She was the Duchess of Voss. She had a title and a seat and a network of 17 active correspondents across the Northern Territory, and she had done more for the practical management of that territory in 10 months than had been done in several years combined. And some number of people in this palace were aware of that, and some were not, and a few were actively annoyed by it. The annoyed ones were the interesting category. She had been expecting them. What she had not fully anticipated was the specific form the annoyance took. It did not come as hostility. She had armored for hostility. It came as something softer and more difficult, a kind of studied forgetfulness. The way certain invitations arrived a day late, after the event had already occurred. The way certain people greeted Caspian warmly and included her with the polite and fractional acknowledgement that is technically correct and practically dismissive. The way conversations in her presence managed, with impressive consistency, to never quite include her, not excluding her rudely, not ignoring her pointedly, simply flowing past her in the way of water around a stone, as though she were a feature of the landscape rather than a person in the conversation. She catalogued it. She was very good at cataloging things. The most sophisticated practitioner of this approach was a woman named Lady Alderton, who was in her late 30s, who had been one of the most influential figures in the court's informal social structure for over a decade, and whose influence rested on the kind of interlocking relationships and careful management of access that Marin, reading the court the way she read estate records, recognized as a genuine skill, even as she acknowledged that the skill was being used against her. Lady Alderton was not cruel, she was tactical. And her tactic, as best Marin could understand it, was to ensure that Marin's presence in the court remained categorized as that of the unexpected Duke's wife, who had come from nowhere, and who the court had not yet quite decided how to place, because a person who has not yet been placed is a person with uncertain status, and uncertain status is useful to someone who manages status for a living. The dinner on the 4th evening was the clearest illustration. It was a dinner of perhaps 40 guests, mid-sized, the kind where the seating arrangement communicates a great deal about who the host thinks matters. She had been seated correctly, in the sense that her rank was honored. She and Caspian were at the upper portion of the table, toward the host and his wife. But the seating on either side of her had been arranged so that her neighbors were people she had no natural connection to, and no established correspondence with, while Caspian's neighbors were people central to the court's current concerns, a pair of advisors and Lady Alderton herself, who sat beside Caspian and leaned toward him during the first course with the practiced ease of someone resuming a conversation she had been managing for years. Marin ate her soup. She talked to the man on her left, who was a minor functionary in the Royal Land Office, and who, when she brought up the county water management framework she had helped formalize over the summer, became genuinely and unreservedly interested in a way that Lady Alderton was probably not expecting him to be. Because Lady Alderton had not known, when she arranged this seating, that the man from the Royal Land Office would turn out to have a strong professional interest in exactly the kind of territorial management work that Marin had been doing. They talked for most of the dinner. He asked excellent questions. She answered them in the specific way she answered questions when the person asking them was not performing interest but actually had it. Directly, fully, without the social fluff that typically padded conversation between strangers at formal dinners. By the end of the evening, she had arranged to meet him at the records office the following week, to review the formalized framework documentation. On her right, the woman who had been seated there, a baroness whose name she had filed and would use correctly when necessary, had been watching this exchange with the slightly alarmed expression of someone who prepared to spend an evening next to a cipher and found a conversation instead. The baroness said, during a lull, "You have been doing land management work in the north." Marin said, "Yes." The baroness said, "My husband has been struggling with a tenancy dispute on our eastern property for over a year." Marin said, "What is the nature of it?" The baroness told her. It was, as many of these disputes were, a combination of an ambiguous original agreement, two parties who had spent a year being right about different things, and a fundamental structural problem in how the tenancy had been established. She could see the shape of it in under 3 minutes of the baroness describing it. She said, "The problem is in the original tenancy agreement. not in either party's behavior since. If the agreement is ambiguous, the resolution is a mediated clarification of the original intent, not an arbitration between competing current interpretations. That changes who pays for the process and what the outcome is likely to be. The Baroness said, "Our solicitor has not framed it that way." Marin said, "Your solicitor is managing the symptoms. The underlying issue is the document." The Baroness said, "Can you recommend someone who would frame it correctly?" Marin said, "I can give you the name of a land records attorney in the north who thinks the way I have just described. He resolved a similar situation for Lady Norville last year." The Baroness said, "I would be very grateful." Marin said she would write the name in the morning and send it. She did. The Baroness wrote back 3 weeks later to say the attorney had been extraordinarily helpful, and the dispute was moving toward resolution in a direction that the previous year of work had entirely failed to produce. This was the evening Lady Alderton noticed. Not the conversation itself, she could not have heard it from where she was sitting, but the quality of attention that the Baroness was giving Marin, and the exchange that had clearly occurred between Marin and the man from the land office, and the expressions of two people at the end of an evening who have found each other useful and know it. All of that was visible to anyone who was watching the room carefully, and Lady Alderton was always watching the room carefully. Marin was aware that she had been seen. She made no particular response. She simply acknowledged it the way she acknowledged any piece of information. Filed, noted, no further action required. After the dinner, while the guests were taking their leave in the hall, Lady Alderton came to her. She said, "Lady Voss, I hope the evening was pleasant." Marin said, "It was. I had an interesting conversation about water management with your land office colleague, and a useful one with the Baroness Renly. I hope yours was equally good." Lady Alderton said, "It was. The Duke is always enjoyable company." There was a fractional pause. Marin said, "Yes, he is." She said it without the slight edge that the comment had been designed to produce, because she had understood the design of the comment before it was finished, and had decided that the correct response was none, or rather, was a warmth that was completely genuine, and that therefore had no edge to meet. Lady Alderton said, "We must have you both to dinner at the Alderton apartments sometime this season." Marin said, "We would enjoy that." She meant it. She had assessed Lady Alderton from the third day of the season, and concluded that the most productive version of this situation was not opposition, but absorption. A person who managed social access could be a problem, or could be a mechanism, depending on whether they were oriented against you or beside you. She was not in the business of making enemies when allies were available. She was also not naive about what absorption required. It required her to be consistently more useful and more pleasant to be around than the alternative version of herself that Lady Alderton had been prepared to navigate, until the alternative version became irrelevant, because the actual version had made itself indispensable. She was good at becoming indispensable. Caspian appeared at her side at some point during the leave-taking. He said nothing. He stood beside her while they made the appropriate departing comments to the host, and then walked with her back through the palace corridors, toward the Voss apartments, which were better than the apartments she had stayed in as Lady Prentice's companion, because rank had material consequences, and she had decided to simply accept this fact without complicated feelings about it. He said, when they were far enough from the dining hall that the sound had faded, "Lady Alderton was watching you during the second course." She said, "I know." He said, and the land office administrator appeared very engaged. She said, "His name is Welland. He is responsible for the county water filing systems in the central provinces. The framework I wrote is going to be relevant to 4 counties under his office's management. I am going to send him the full documentation this week." He said, "That was a productive dinner." She said, "Most dinners are, if you sit next to the right people." He said, "You did not sit next to the right people. You were seated next to the ones they expected to be least connected to your interests." She said, "And yet." He looked at her. He said, "And yet." They walked the rest of the way in the comfortable quiet that had become the ordinary texture of their evenings together, and she was thinking about the framework documentation, and he was, she suspected, thinking about the territorial management problems he had discussed with the advisors at his end of the table, and neither of them needed to say any of this, because they had both been doing the work all evening, and would continue doing it in the morning. In the Voss apartments, she sat at the writing desk and made notes for the Welland documentation while the fire burned, and Caspian read in the chair by the window. At some point she said, without looking up, "Alderton is going to invite us to dinner within the week." He said, "Yes." She said, "I will accept." He said, "I expected you would." She said, "It is useful to be known by someone who manages access." He said, "And you would rather be known than managed." She looked up. He was still reading, but the corner of his mouth had done the thing it did when something amused him. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the physical signal of a thought that reached the outside of his face before he had decided whether to let it. She said, "Yes, I would rather be known." She went back to her notes. Outside the window, the autumn city was its usual self, noisy, complicated, running on its own logic. She was learning its logic the way she had learned the duchy's logic and the estate's logic and Lady Prentice's logic, methodically, from the source documents, with patience that was not patience but strategy. She would be more comfortable by spring. She was already more comfortable than anyone in that dining room had expected. She wrote the first section of the documentation and moved on to the second. The Alderton dinner arrived in the 6th day, which was slightly faster than Marin had predicted, suggesting that Lady Alderton had revised her assessment more quickly than usual. This was useful information about the speed of her processing. The dinner itself was small, 8 people, which was the size Lady Alderton used for evenings where she wanted to actually talk rather than simply manage. The table was round, which prevented the kind of hierarchical seating that had characterized the earlier dinner, and the conversation was permitted to move rather than being steered. Lady Alderton was a very good host. Marin observed this without reservation, because being a very good host was a real skill, and she had enough respect for real skills to acknowledge them regardless of where they resided. The woman knew how to move a conversation, when to enter it, and when to let it find its own direction, and how to make each person at the table feel that the evening had been specifically organized with them in mind, which was not true, but was not a lie either. It was the result of extremely careful preparation. Marin said very little during the first 2 courses. She listened. She was cataloging. During the 3rd course, Lady Alderton directed a question at her, a specific, informed question about the Northern Territory's water management situation, which told Marin that she had done some preparation, and that the preparation had been thorough enough to get past the surface level. Marin answered it. Then she answered the follow-up question. Then she asked Lady Alderton a question in return, about the Central Province county systems, because Lady Alderton had connections to several families whose land fell under those systems, and Marin was working on the Welland documentation, and the connections were potentially useful. Lady Alderton answered it. She answered it well, and somewhere in the exchange, specific, informed, neither of them performing but both of them actually thinking, something in the texture of the evening shifted. By the end of the dinner, they had talked, between themselves and with the others at the table, about territorial management, about county filing systems, about 3 land disputes in different stages of resolution, and about the particular problem of spring water access, in areas where the snowmelt timing varied significantly between higher and lower elevation farms. Lady Alderton's husband, who was a quieter version of his wife, and who clearly deferred to her social intelligence, while being considerable in his own right, said to Marin as they were leaving, "I understand you have been doing very good work in the north." She said, "There was good work to be done." He said, "There always is. The question is always whether the person doing it sees it." She said, "I try to see what is there." He said, "Yes, I think you do." In the carriage back to the Voss apartments, Caspian said, "Lady Alderton introduced you to her husband's cousin at the end of the evening. Did you notice?" She said, "The one from the Agricultural Review Committee?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I noticed." He said, "She doesn't introduce people she doesn't intend to be useful to each other." She said, "I know. I said useful things to her at dinner." He said, "You said true things." She said, "True and useful are not always different." He looked at the window of the carriage. He said, "I have been attending these dinners for 3 years, and I have never left one feeling that something had actually been accomplished." She said, What did you accomplish at those dinners? He said, I maintained relationships. I kept channels open. It was important, but not forward-moving. She said, tonight was forward-moving. He said, yes, I noticed. She said, the Agricultural Review Committee has been discussing the water access framework with the county offices since I sent Welland the documentation. If the cousin is on the committee, it explains why she introduced us tonight. She is connecting elements that are already moving. He said, and now you are connected to the committee through the cousin. She said, and through Welland. 2 routes are better than 1. He said nothing for a moment. The carriage moved through the city. She was already composing the follow-up letter to the cousin in her mind. Not writing it, not fully, but drafting the shape of it, the angle it needed to take. He said, can I ask you something? She said, yes. He said, do you find any of this, she waited for the word, enjoyable? She thought about it. It was a real question, asked as a real question, not as a social prompt or an opening for the exchange of pleasantries, and she thought about it carefully. She said, the work itself, yes, the solving of things, the way a well-written letter can accomplish in 2 paragraphs what 6 months of meetings couldn't. The moment when the documentation arrives at the right person's desk, and you can see, in the reply, that they understood it. She said, the social navigation, no, not enjoyable, necessary, I understand it, and I am good at it, and it produces results, but it is not the part I would choose, if I were choosing. He said, what would you choose? She said, the records office, the land register, the correspondence files, the problem that is actually a different problem than it appears to be. He said, yes. She said, is that surprising? He said, no, it is the same answer I would give. They looked at each other in the moving carriage, in the city's light coming through the window in broken pieces, and it was not a dramatic moment, and neither of them treated it as one, but it was the kind of moment where a thing is confirmed that had been suspected, and the confirmation settles something that was previously only assumed. She said, we are going to be back in the north in 6 weeks. He said, 53 days. She said, are you counting? He said, I am always counting. She said, I did not know that. He said, now you do. She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back, and outside the carriage, the city went on being the city, noisy and indifferent, and entirely uninterested in 2 people discovering, in a moving vehicle on a cold autumn night, that they had more in common than either of them had yet said aloud. She turned back to the window. She was composing the letter to the Agricultural Committee cousin. She was also, somewhere at the same time, in a way that she had not fully examined, and did not intend to examine tonight, aware of the feeling that had been growing steadily since January, and that was, if she was being honest with herself, no longer possible to entirely attribute to the satisfaction of productive work. She was not ready to say this yet. She filed it the way she filed things she needed to return to, clearly, without distortion, in the part of her mind reserved for things that would need addressing when the time was right. The carriage arrived at the apartments. She went in and wrote the letter. The mistake happened on a Thursday. It was a small mistake, in the sense that it produced no permanent consequence, and was corrected within an hour of occurring. It was also a significant mistake, in the sense that it told her something about the limits of what she had understood about him, and about the limits of what he had, so far, been willing to let her see. They were at a midweek gathering at the home of Lord and Lady Stowe, who were pleasant people, with a good house, and a tendency to invite too many guests to fit comfortably in their dining room, resulting in the particular crush of a party that is attempting to be more formal than the available space will support. Marin was in the second sitting room, which was smaller than the main one, but better ventilated, talking to Lord Graves, who had returned to the capital for the season, and who had, since the summer meeting, become one of the most useful correspondents in her northern network, about the road access framework she had drafted for his eastern corridor situation. The conversation was going well. Graves had done the reading she had sent him, and he had questions that showed he had understood it, and they were in the middle of working through the second question when she heard, across the room, a voice that she had not been tracking because she had not had reason to, and then, for a moment, she had every reason. It was a woman named Lady Prescott, one of the capital's permanent residents, well-connected, with the particular fluency of someone who has been at the center of social life for long enough to conduct it automatically. She was talking to Caspian. She was talking to him with the specific warmth of someone who has known a person in a previous chapter of their life and is retrieving that ease. Maren could hear the tone rather than the words from across the room. She could also see, because she was watching, the precise moment when someone near Lady Prescott asked about the Duchy's Northern Water Management project. She heard the words, Northern Water Management, from across the room, because she was attuned to them. And Lady Prescott, with the smooth confidence of someone who has never needed to wait to be included in a conversation, said something, and Caspian, and this was the moment. Caspian answered her, not the someone. And the answer went on for a short while, and it was an answer about the Northern Water Management Framework, and it was correct, and it was also entirely his answer, given in his voice, without reference to the person who had written the framework, built the network, and spent the past 10 months turning the concept into a working system. It lasted perhaps 45 seconds. Lord Graves, who was perceptive, registered the change in her attention. He said, "Is something wrong?" She said, "No." She returned to the conversation. They finished the discussion about the Eastern Corridor road access. She was present for it. She answered his questions. She said the right things. But a portion of her attention had gone to that 45 seconds across the room, and what it had shown her, and what she was doing with it. She was not hurt. She was surprised, which was different. She had not fully understood, until this moment, that there was a version of Caspian that appeared in the presence of certain people. People from before. People who had known him in the years when the territory that is now her work was simply undone. That was the version that had always been there, and that reverted, without apparent notice, to its old patterns. The version that spoke in the first person about things that were no longer, in any practical sense, only his. It was not malicious. She was certain of that. It was the way old habits reassert themselves in familiar contexts, and Lady Prescott was an old context. This did not make it smaller. It made it more complicated. She excused herself from Lord Graves when the conversation reached a natural pause and moved through the room to the less crowded space near the east wall, where there was air and a window and enough distance from the main cluster of people that she could think without the pressure of performing conversation. She stood at the window. Outside, the evening city was lamplit and moving. She thought, what he said was not inaccurate. The framework is real. The work is real. He was describing it correctly. He simply described it as though it had emerged from the ether. She thought, he has been learning who I am since November. People do not learn completely in 10 months. She thought, this is information about where the edges of his awareness still are. She thought, I am going to need to decide what to do with it. He found her at the window, approximately 12 minutes later. She knew he had been looking for her. She had watched, from her peripheral vision, the moment he realized she was not in the second sitting room, and began the mild, purposeful movement of a person searching without appearing to search. He came to stand beside her. He said, "You moved." She said, "I needed air." He said, "What happened?" She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the clear and attentive expression that was his default expression when something was requiring real attention, and she thought, he already knows. He is not asking because he does not know. He is asking because he wants to hear what I say. She said, "I heard you talking about the water management framework." He said nothing. She said, 45 seconds. You described it correctly. You did not mention me. He was very still. She said, I am not saying this to punish you for it. I am saying it because I need you to understand it, and I do not think you realized it was happening. He said, I did not. She said, I know. He said, that is not an excuse. She said, I know that too. He looked at the window. The lamplight was coming in at an angle, and his face was partly in shadow, and she looked at him and saw, for the first time clearly, the thing that had been underneath the competent and careful version of him that she had been working alongside for 10 months, the thing she had suspected from the library, from the gloves, from the sentence he had said about readiness, that he had been managing, for 3 years, a version of himself that was entirely self-contained, entirely self-referencing, and that she was still, in some of the grooves of that self, not yet fully present. She said, "It is going to take time to change the automatic version." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am not asking for it to be perfect immediately." He said, "You are asking for me to be aware." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am aware now." She said, "I know." They stood at the window for a moment. Neither of them moved away. The party went on behind them, the layered noise of a crowded room managing itself. And they were at the edge of it, in the specific way that two people stand at the edge of a loud thing when the thing between them is quiet. He said, "I will correct it." She said, "How?" He said, "Lady Prescott is still in the room. I will go back and correct it directly." She said, "That will be conspicuous." He said, "Yes. It will also be accurate." She said, "You do not have to do it that way." He said, "I know. I want to." She looked at him. He looked back. And in the looking, in the specific gravity of his intention, she felt something that she had been filing away since January, and that she had been careful not to let resolve before it was ready. Felt it resolve, quietly, not with drama, but with the particular solidity of a thing that has been building in the correct direction and has finally arrived at its proper place. She said, "All right." He said, "I will be back." He went back into the room. She watched from the window. She could not hear what he said, but she could see the conversation. Lady Prescott, the group around her, Caspian speaking for a short while with the clear and direct manner he brought to things that needed clarity. She saw Lady Prescott's expression change, register, adjust. She saw the man who had originally asked the question nod. She saw Caspian say one more thing. He came back. She said, "What did you say?" He said, "I said that the framework and the network and the operational work in the North are my wife's. That I follow the correspondence and review the outcomes, but the design and the execution are hers." She said, "And?" He said, "Lady Prescott said she was not surprised, and that she hoped to have an introduction." She said, "And?" He said, "I said she could write directly to you, that you handled your own introductions." She said, "You said that." He said, "It is true." She looked at him for a moment. The lamplight, the noise, the room full of people, none of whom were paying attention to this window in this moment. She said, "Yes, it is." She said nothing else for a moment, and he said nothing, and the thing that had resolved sat between them without needing to be named, because there are things that are strong enough that naming them is redundant. She said, "The Graves Road access situation needs a planning document before the winter. I want to draft it this week." He said, "I can give you the Eastern Corridor survey maps." Hartwell brought them. She said, "Tomorrow." He said, "Yes." They went back to the party. Separately, she to Lord Graves, who was still willing to talk, and he to the other side of the room, where the evening's conversations continued. But across the room, at some point, she looked over and he looked over at the same moment, and it was not significant, and it was also the most significant thing that had happened all evening, and neither of them did anything about it, because the room was the room, and there was time. She wrote the planning document for the Graves situation that Friday. It was clean and complete, and it did exactly what it needed to do, and she sent it before the week was out. Lady Prescott wrote to her on Saturday. The letter was gracious and specific, and contained a genuine question about the framework's application to a drainage situation she had heard about through a family connection in the South. It was, in short, the letter of a person who had decided to engage seriously, and was doing so. Marin wrote back on the same day. 17 active correspondence. 18. 3 days after the Stowe gathering, she received a letter from Delia. It was a longer letter than Delia's usual, written in the slightly cramped hand of someone who has been waiting for enough uninterrupted time to write at length, and has finally found it. It covered the children. The older one had begun a formal curriculum, and was, according to Delia, alarmingly quick at mathematics, which she attributed directly to Marin's side of the family, and the grain business, which was having a reasonable year, and a local dispute about a market day that had somehow become very complicated. And then, in the last quarter of the letter, it said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, the way you used to answer things when we were children, and you had not yet learned to be careful." It said, "Are you happy?" She read the question 3 times. She thought, Delia is asking because it has been a year. Because the first year of a marriage is the year when the truth of it settles into something real. And Delia is old enough and practical enough to know this, and she wants to know the actual answer rather than the performed one. She sat at the desk with the letter and thought about the question with the same care she gave to the questions in the land register and the county records and the water rights framework. She thought, happy is a word that does a lot of work for its size. She thought, I am doing the most meaningful work of my adult life. That is true, and it is not nothing. She thought, I am understood, in this particular marriage, in a way that I have not been understood before. That is also true. That is also not nothing. She thought, the feeling I filed in January, and that resolved at the Stowe party window, that is something different from work satisfaction and from being understood. That is something I have been being careful with, because being careful has always been my strategy for things that matter. She wrote back to Delia. She said, I am going to answer this carefully, because I do not want to say more than is true or less than is true, and I want to get the proportion right. She said, I am content, which is a word I used to think was smaller than happy, and have come to understand is actually steadier. I am doing work I believe in, with someone I respect deeply, in a situation that is mine, in the way that the Ashvale estate was supposed to be mine but never was, and Lady Prentice's estate could not be. She said, and there is something else, which I am still in the process of understanding, and which I am being careful with, in the way you told me to stop being careful. So perhaps you are right that I have not fully stopped being careful. But I want to tell you that the something else is there, and it is real, and I intend to do something about it when I understand it clearly enough to do something about it well. She sealed the letter and sent it. Delia's reply arrived 10 days later, which was fast, which meant she had written it quickly, which meant she had things to say. The reply said, the something else is happiness. You are describing it very carefully, the way you describe everything, but it is happiness, and I am glad. She read this at her desk in the Capitol, in the good north-facing office in the Voss Apartments, the one that Caspian had arranged without being asked, in the same way he had arranged things throughout the year that he had observed were needed before she asked for them, and she sat with it for a moment. She thought, Delia is probably right. She thought, I should do something about this. She was not, by nature or by practice, a person who named feelings and then did nothing with them. The notebook that she kept, the practical one, for lists and schedules and the estate work, also contained, in its margins and on pages she kept turned to the inside, a set of notes that were of a different kind, not records of things she had done, records of things she had noticed, about the way he looked when he was reading something he found genuinely interesting, about the particular quality of his attention in the mornings, before the day had properly started, when they were in the office with the correspondence, and he asked a question that was not a professional question, about the night after the Stowe party when she had gone to the desk to write and he had stayed reading in the chair longer than usual, not because he was not tired, but because she was there, and he did not want to leave the room. These notes existed. She had been keeping them the way she kept all important records, accurately, without distortion, without the kind of editorial that turns a record into a story. She read them now. She thought, Delia is right. She put the notebook in the drawer with Lady Prentice's letters. She went to find him. He was in the estate office, the one they had set up in the Voss Apartments for the capital months, reading through a packet of territorial correspondence that Hartwell had sent up from the north. He looked up when she came in the natural way, not the performance of attention, but the actual turning of a person who has heard a familiar footstep. She said, I need to tell you something. He put the correspondence down. She said, I wrote to my sister this week about whether I was happy. I told her there was something I was still understanding. She wrote back and told me what it was. He waited. She said, she told me it was happiness. He was very still. She said, I think she is right. I wanted you to know. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, very quietly and very directly, in the specific way he said things that were true and important. I have known for some time. She said, how long? He said, since the morning in January, when you found the mill error in the land register in 34 minutes, and sent me a note about it, as though it were a normal thing to do. She said, "That was the first month." He said, "Yes." She said, "You have known since the first month." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you did not say anything." He said, "You were being careful. I did not want to move faster than you needed to move." She stood in the office doorway and looked at him, and what she felt was not exactly what the word happiness described. It was larger and more complicated and more solid than the word happiness described. But it was in the same direction as the word, and it was real, and it had been building since January, and was now simply present, the way the Southfield drainage was now simply present, quietly and correctly, and without needing to be made a moment of. She said, "I am going to stop being quite so careful." He said, "I know." She said, slowly. He said, "I am not in a hurry." She came into the office and sat down at the small table by the window, where the afternoon light was coming in, the way it came in at this hour, and she picked up the territorial correspondence file that she had been working through that morning, and she said, "The Graves Road Access Planning document is going to need a revision, based on the survey maps. I found an error in the eastern sector elevations." He said, "What kind of error?" She said, "The same kind as the mill survey, transposed coordinates. Someone in the survey office has a consistent way of making mistakes." He said, "I will write to the survey office." She said, "I will draft the letter." He said, "Of course." They worked. The afternoon moved. The correspondence went through. Outside the window, the city did what cities do, continued, without regard for what was happening in any particular room inside it. She worked at the small table. He worked at the large desk. And between them, in the office that was theirs and the way that things become yours when you have worked in them long enough, was the kind of quiet that has nothing left to be anxious about, the kind that two people build without planning to, out of mornings and correspondence and dinners, and the careful accumulation of days that are real. She crossed an item off the list. The list was very short now. She was not in a hurry about the last items. There was time. The winter came back the way northern winters do, without ceremony, simply present one morning where it had not been the morning before, the temperature dropping overnight, and the frost on the ground when they rode out at dawn to check the north track, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, the horses moving with the deliberate and slightly energetic quality of animals that prefer cold weather to warm. They had been back at the Voss seat for a month. The capital season had ended in the way capital seasons end. A gradual reduction of events, a thinning of the correspondence that required her physical presence, a diminishing of the particular social pressure that accumulated over 2 months, of being always around people who were always performing. She had not realized how much of her energy it consumed until she was no longer consuming it, and the first week back at the North House was the best sleep she had had since the previous winter. The list was down to 2 items. One was a long-term infrastructure project, the repair and improvement of the main North Road between the Voss seat and the county market town, which required coordination with the county works office and a budget amendment and a contracting process, all of which she had in motion, but which would not complete until the following spring. The second was a piece of work she had set aside deliberately and was going to return to in the new year, a review of the estate's tenancy agreements, all 23 of them, which had not been comprehensively reviewed in many years, and which she suspected contained the same kind of long-standing ambiguities that had produced the Norville drainage problem and the Farwell water rights situation. The 2 items did not trouble her. They were large and real, and she would do them correctly, and they would be done. What occupied her more, in the winter, was not the list. The winter at the Voss seat was, in practical terms, quieter than any other season. The correspondence thinned. The territory's landowners were inside managing their own households. The county offices reduced to a skeleton staff. The northern road was too difficult for casual travel. They had the estate, the staff, the work that did not stop in winter, the accounts, the planning, the review work, and each other. She had not fully understood, before this winter, what each other meant when there was nothing else required. The days were good. She worked in the morning, and he worked in the morning, and they had lunch at the kitchen table, because the formal dining room in winter felt like eating in a cave, and then the afternoon was whatever the afternoon needed to be, more work, or the horses, or the library, or a walk on the north track if the weather permitted. Evenings were books and fire and the comfortable quiet. She had stopped being careful, in the way she had told him she would stop. Not dramatically. She did not have a dramatic version of herself to deploy, but steadily. She said things that she had previously filed for later, and she said them when they occurred to her, rather than when she had determined the time was correct, and the sky did not fall, and the things she said were received as they were intended. He had a version of the same adjustment he was making, which she observed with the same careful attention she gave to everything. He was a private person, privately private, not the kind of private that performed intimacy at the appropriate social moments and closed itself down in the spaces between. He was simply, constitutionally, someone for whom the interior life was interior, and what he let out of it was genuine and not abundant. She respected this. She was not looking for abundance. She was looking for the genuine, and the genuine was there, offered at a rate that was entirely his own, but that was, she had come to understand, increasing. There was an evening in the second month of winter when she came into the sitting room and found him at the desk. Not the work desk, the smaller one, by the window that they used for things that were not official, and he was writing by hand rather than dictating, which he did only for the correspondence he did not want Hartwell to see first. She sat in the chair by the fire and opened her book and did not ask. An hour later he set down the pen. He held the paper. He looked at it. He folded it and held it folded. She said, "You do not have to tell me what it is." He said, "I know." He held it for another moment. He said, "I am going to tell you anyway." She waited. He said, "I have been trying to write a letter to the king." She said, "The king wrote to you last month. Did you not reply?" He said, "I replied to that letter. This is a different one." He asked me, privately, before the season ended, he asked why I chose you. She was very still. He said, "I have been writing this letter since November. I have 6 drafts. None of them are right." She said, "What is wrong with them?" He said, "They are all true. None of them are sufficient." He looked at the folded paper. He said, "The first draft said it was because you were reading in the Great Hall and I recognized something. The second said it was because of the land register error in 34 minutes. The third said it was because of what you said about readiness, that waiting for readiness is a strategy that eventually fails. The fourth tried to explain what it feels like to be in a room where someone is paying the same kind of attention to the world that you are paying to it, and how rare that is, and how I did not know I had been waiting for it." He said, "The fifth draft was 1 sentence." She said, "What did it say?" He looked at the folded paper in his hands. He said, "It said that she was the only real thing in the room." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "And the 6th?" He said, "The 6th is the one in my hand. I wrote it tonight." She said nothing. He said, "I am not going to send it." She said, "I know." He said, "Not because it is wrong, because it is for me, not for him." He stood up. He crossed the room to the bookshelf, the smaller one by the fire, where the books they were currently reading lived alongside the ones they kept returning to. And he put the folded letter into the book that was on the second shelf from the top, the one she had been carrying on the day they met, which had traveled from the palace to the library to the North House, and which had been on that shelf, now, for a year. He did not say anything. He sat back down in his chair and picked up his own book. She looked at the shelf, she looked at the book, she looked at him. He was reading, or he was holding the book and looking at it, which was close enough. She said, "I am going to read that letter." He said, "I know." She said, "Not tonight." He said, "Whenever you want." She went back to her own book. She did not read her own book. She read 2 pages and retained none of them, because she was thinking about a man who had spent 2 months writing letters he could not get right to describe something that was, she thought, perfectly and accurately described by the 6th draft, and its 1 sentence, which she had not yet read, but which she already understood. The fire went on burning. The winter went on being winter. The house was very quiet, and in the quiet, she could hear the small sounds of the building in the cold, the settling of the old stone, the distant sounds of the night staff making their rounds, the particular silence that a good house has at the end of a long day. She said, without looking up from the book she was not reading, the letter in the 3rd draft, about waiting for readiness. He said, Yes. She said, I said that to you in the library. In the second conversation, he said, yes. She said, you remembered it exactly. He said, I remember most of what you say. I have since the beginning. She looked at the book in her hands. She said, that is, she paused, not for effect, but because the word was in the process of arriving, and she wanted to get it right. That is the nicest thing anyone has done for me, without my knowing. He said, I know it is yours. I wrote it down. I just kept it. She put the book down on her lap. She said, I will read the 6th draft tomorrow. He said, take your time. She picked the book back up. She did not read any more of it. But she sat with it in her hands in the warmth of the fire, and he sat in his chair, and the house was quiet and safe and entirely theirs, and the letter was in the book on the shelf. And none of this needed to be said aloud because all of it was already present in the room, in a way that the room itself made room for. She slept well that night. In the morning, before breakfast, before the correspondence arrived, before the day became the day, she went to the shelf and took down the book and opened it. His handwriting was precise, as it always was. The letter was a page and a half. She read it standing at the shelf, in the early light, with the house still quiet around her. She read the sentence at the end last. She stood with the letter for a moment after she finished it. Then she folded it carefully, the way he had folded it, and put it back between the pages of the book, and put the book back on the shelf. She went to the kitchen and made the morning tea, because the kitchen staff did not start until the 6th hour, and she had always been an early riser, and she stood at the kitchen window with the tea going, and looked at the frost on the north field, and the pale and specific quality of the light at this hour in winter, and thought about the sentence at the end of the letter. She thought, he is right. She thought, he was right in November, when he wrote it, and he was right in the Great Hall, before either of them knew he was going to be right about it. She thought, I was the realest thing in the room, not because of anything I did, because I was simply being what I actually was, without the performance of it, and he was a person who could see that, and was paying enough attention to recognize it. She thought, that is, as it turns out, the most important thing about him. She poured 2 cups. She carried them back to the sitting room, where he was already there, in the early morning, with his book open and the fire going from last night's coals, and she set 1 cup beside him without saying anything, and sat in her chair with the other, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and outside, the frost was on the north field, and the winter was being the winter. She opened her book. She read the page she had not retained the night before. It was a good page. The tenancy review began in the new year, as she had planned. She started with the oldest agreements, the ones that predated the current tenant families by 2 or 3 generations, the ones written in the legal style of 40 years ago, which was more verbose and less precise than current practice, and which had a tendency to rely on the shared understanding of terms that no longer meant the same things they had meant when the agreement was written. She found 3 potential ambiguities in the first 6 agreements. She made notes. She moved on. It was the kind of work that required a very specific quality of sustained attention, not the energetic attention of solving an active problem, but the patient attention of reading something slowly enough to catch what it is almost saying, rather than what it is actually saying. She was good at it. She had always been good at it, since childhood, when she had read her father's estate ledgers and found the discrepancies that her father had trusted his steward to not have. She had told her father about those discrepancies, at 11 years old, at breakfast, in the specific matter-of-fact way of a child who has found something that seems wrong and assumes the adults will want to know. Her father had looked at the ledger and looked at her and said, very gently, that she was probably misreading it, and that these things were complicated, and that she should perhaps not concern herself with the estate management. She had known, at 11, that she was not misreading it. She had known that her father knew she was not misreading it. She had also known, at 11, that this particular situation was one she could not solve, because the solution required an authority she did not have, and the person who had the authority was sitting across the breakfast table choosing not to use it. She had not thought about this in a long time. The tenancy review had brought it back, the way that specific tasks sometimes retrieve specific memories. Not painfully, just clearly, the way an old document retrieves its context. She made a note about the third ambiguous clause in Agreement 7 and set it with the others. Hartwell appeared in the doorway at the end of the morning. He said, "The fourth volume of the tenancy records has been found in the east storage room. It was misfiled as correspondence rather than contracts." She said, "Bring it." He brought it. She added it to the stack on the desk. He said, "My lady, the review you are doing. I have been meaning to say something about it." She said, "Say it." He said, "I knew the agreements were old. I knew several of them needed attention. He paused in the careful way of a man choosing precise words. "I was not addressing it at the rate it required." She said, "I know." He said, "I want to be useful to you in addressing it now." She said, "You are useful. You know where the fourth volume is. You know which tenants have been here the longest. You know which of the older agreements were the ones that came with complications, because you were here when the complications occurred." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need that knowledge, not as my steward telling me what I need to know, as someone who remembers things that are not in the documents." He said, "I understand." She said, "Sit down. Tell me about the Kellaway Agreement." He sat. He told her about the Kellaway Agreement, which was from 32 years ago and which had a clause about water access that both parties had been interpreting differently for 20 years, and which had never come to a formal dispute, because the Kellaway family and the estate family had maintained good personal relations through 3 successive generations, and personal relations had kept the structural problem from becoming visible. She listened. She asked 4 questions, the kind that opened rather than narrowed. He answered them. She made notes. They worked through 4 agreements in the afternoon. He knew things that were not in any document: the context of a decision, the personality of a previous tenant, the reason a clause had been written in a way that looked strange now but had been entirely sensible at the time. She knew things that he had not had the perspective to see. The patterns across agreements, the way a recurring ambiguity pointed to a systemic gap rather than individual carelessness. At some point during the third agreement, he said, "You know, my lady, when I heard the Duke had chosen you, I did not." He stopped. She said, "Say it." He said, "I did not understand." She said, "And now?" He said, "Now I think the estate may be in the best hands it has been in since the founder's time, and that is not a judgment I make lightly." She said, "It is a very generous judgment." He said, "It is an accurate one." She said, "The foundation was good. The Duke built it solid." He said, "Yes, he did. But a solid foundation is not a house." She looked at the agreement in front of her. She made a note. She said, "The Kellaway Water Access Clause can be resolved without renegotiating the full agreement. A supplementary letter, signed by both parties, confirming the shared interpretation. It makes the existing practice formal, without disrupting anything that's working." He said, "The Kellaways will agree. They are practical people." She said, "I know. I read their correspondence from last year. Write to them this week, and tell them we are reviewing the older agreements, and would like to formalize the water access arrangement." He said, "Yes, my lady." He wrote the letter the same afternoon. The Kellaways replied within the week. The supplementary agreement was signed before the month was out. She filed it in the tenancy records and moved on to the next agreement. The review took 3 months. At the end of it, 23 agreements had been read completely. 6 had been formally updated. 3 had received supplementary letters. 1 had been identified as requiring full renegotiation in the next cycle, and the remaining 13 were found to be sound. She compiled a summary. She wrote the renegotiation recommendation. She updated the tenancy index that Hartwell kept. She sat back and looked at the completed stack. The list was now 1 item. The North Road Project. She pulled the North Road file toward her. The North Road project would take until summer. She had known this from the beginning. She had planned accordingly. She was not impatient. She turned to the first page of the file and began to read. 5 years. She knew it was 5 years the way she knew most things. Not because she had been counting sentimentally, but because the count was in the records. The 5th year was in the accounts, in the contract renewals, in the renewal date of the North Road maintenance agreement that she had finally formalized in the summer of the 2nd year, which had just come up for its first review. 5 years of accounts. 5 years of correspondence. 5 years of the estate doing what it was supposed to do, slowly and correctly and without drama, in the way that good management produces results. Not in events, but in the accumulated quality of things that work as they should. She was at her desk on a Tuesday morning in late spring, with the window open and the smell of the fields coming in on the air. Not unpleasant, the specific smell of good agricultural land in the growing season. The smell of her desk, and this room, and the life she had arranged here. The desk had been in the office when she arrived, and was still here, marked now with 5 more years of use, and she knew every mark on it the way you know the features of a face that has been in front of you long enough to stop requiring attention. The correspondence on the desk was the ordinary weight of a Tuesday. 4 letters to the county office about the road review, a set of accounts from Hartwell for her to check before they went to the quarterly review, a letter from Lady Norville about a new proposal for the Aldenmere Creek management that they had been building toward for 2 seasons, and a letter from Delia with news from the south. She was reading Delia's letter when she heard him in the corridor. He had a particular set of sounds, not loud, not announcing, but present, the way his door opened, the quality of his footsteps, which were even and deliberate, and which she had learned to read the way you learn to read the weather that you live with. She knew from the footsteps whether it had been a good correspondence morning or a complicated one, whether he was moving toward his desk or toward the kitchen, whether he was heading for the library or the stable. These were Tuesday footsteps. He was moving with the slightly more purposeful quality of someone who had found something interesting in the morning correspondence and was coming to say so. He knocked on the open door, because they had always knocked on open doors, not out of formality, but because they had both independently decided, early in the first year, that a knock on an open door was a small and important courtesy, a way of saying, "I am entering your space, and I am asking before I do." She said, "Come in." He came in. He was carrying a letter. He said, "Farwell is proposing to extend the water rights framework to the Western County." She said, "He has been building to that since March. Has he written to the county office?" He said, "He has written to me and is asking whether we will support the proposal to the county office." She said, "We will, with amendments. The Western County has a different groundwater situation. The Eastern framework needs adjustment before it applies cleanly." He said, "Do you want to draft the amendments or tell Farwell to propose and then amend?" She said, "I will draft the amendments. Tell Farwell we support the proposal in principle and that I am preparing a technical supplement. Give him 2 weeks." He said, "He will be pleased." She said, "Farwell is always pleased when someone does the technical work for him. He is a good political operator and a limited technical thinker, and he knows it, which is why the correspondence with me has been productive. I do the part he cannot do, and he does the part I find tedious." He said, "What part do you find tedious?" She said, "The county committee meetings, the formal presentations, the part where you have to stand in a room and make a political case for something that is correct on its own merits." He said, "I do those." She said, "I know, it is an excellent arrangement." He looked at the letter. He said, "The Western County Extension, if it formalizes, that is the 3rd territory where the framework is operating." She said, "4th, the Southern Agricultural Review Committee adapted it for the upland water allocation system last winter." He said, "4 territories." She said, "Yes." He said, "You wrote the original framework in 3 weeks." She said, "I had the foundation in January of the first year. The formal framework took 3 weeks to write." He said, "You never told me about the January work." She said, "You gave me the book with the 16th century drainage chapter in January of the first year." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes." She said, "You knew something was possible. I read the chapter and understood what it was. The framework was the result of both." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she recognized, the expression that was not performed, that was simply what appeared there when he was encountering something that he needed a moment to hold before he could say anything about it. He said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it correctly." She waited. She had learned to wait for him the way she waited for things she knew were coming and were worth the pause. He said, "The estate when you arrived was sound. I had kept it sound. I want to say clearly that I know the difference between keeping something sound and building something. What has been built here is yours. She said, it is ours. He said, it began with you. She said, it began with you managing 3 years alone after a war, which produced the land register error and the wrong furrow patterns and the inflexible contracts, but which also produced a staff that was loyal, a financial base that was stable, and a network of relationships in this territory that I could work within, rather than having to build from scratch. Without what you built, I had nothing to build on. He said, you would have found a way. She said, I would have found a slower way, with more friction. You had already made the territory trust Voss judgment. That is not a small thing. He sat down in the chair at the small table, the chair that had become his chair in her office over the years, not by decision, but by the accumulation of mornings where he had brought his correspondence to discuss and stayed. And he said, I have been thinking about something. She said, tell me. He said, the king has been asking me to take a position on the Northern Territorial Council, a formal position, as the regional representative for land management policy. It would require more time in the capital. She said, how much more time? He said, approximately 4 additional months per year. She said, which months? He said, winter and early spring, when the estate work is lightest. She said, does the position have any practical authority or is it advisory? He said, it has both, depending on the issue. The authority is real on boundary, and land management matters. On agricultural policy it is advisory until the council reaches consensus. She said, then the authority matters, and the advisory role is a mechanism for building toward authority on the agriculture questions. He said, yes. She said, would the correspondence work come through the estate or through the council office? He said, through me, but I want it to come through you. The land management questions will need your technical work. The political cases will be mine. She said, like the Farwell arrangement. He said, at a larger scale. She said, I will need the full council documentation and the current policy positions of each territorial representative before I can say anything useful. He said, I will have Hartwell get them. She said, I also want to review the terms of the appointment before you accept. He said, I expected you would. I have not accepted yet. She said, you want to accept? He said, I think it is the right thing to do for the territory. Yes. She said, then accept it. I will review the terms this week and flag anything that needs amendment before the acceptance is formal. He said, I will tell the king this week. She said, tell him the terms review is mine. He said, yes. He sat in the chair for a moment. She went back to Delia's letter, which she had been reading when he came in, and the spring air was coming in from the window, and the fields were doing what fields do in late spring, growing, correctly, in the properly draining soil. He said, I read everything you write, every letter in the correspondence files, every report, every note in the margins of the contracts. Not because I need to review your work. You do not need reviewing, because I want to know how your mind moves. I have wanted to know since the gallery corridor, and I still do, and I expect I will for the rest of my life. She was quiet for a moment. She said, the 6th draft said she was the only real thing in the room. He said, yes. She said, you are still right about that. He said, I know. She said, I know you know. I am saying it so it is said. He said, thank you. She said, you are welcome. She went back to Delia's letter. He sat in his chair. Outside, the spring morning continued. At some point she said, Delia is asking us to come south this summer. Her daughter has been asking to meet the aunt who does the interesting work. He said, should we go? She said, yes. After the North Road review and before the capital season. He said, I will write to Delia. She said, I will write to Delia. You write to Farwell. He said, the division of labor is very clear. She said, it has always been very clear. He said, yes, it has. She folded Delia's letter and picked up the Norville letter, which was the next thing on the desk, and which needed a reply today. She read it through with the full attention she gave everything. Not quickly, not impatiently, but completely. It was a good letter. Lady Norville was, as she had always been, a practical and intelligent correspondent, and the proposal she had built was careful and well-reasoned and required only minor adjustment before it could be submitted to the county office. She picked up her pen. She wrote the reply in one draft because she rarely needed two anymore for correspondence of this kind. She knew the territory and the issues and the people well enough that the first version was usually right, and the review was a check rather than a revision. She signed it. She sealed it. She set it on the outgoing stack. She picked up the next letter. The morning moved. The accounts needed checking. The Norville reply went out. The Farwell question needed a technical supplement that she would begin this afternoon. The county road review file was on the corner of the desk, waiting. He left her office at some point and went back to his. She could hear him in the corridor, and then the sound of his door, and then the ordinary quiet of two people working in adjacent rooms, which was the sound that the house had most of the time now. Not silence, not the specific silence of a house where something is missing or unresolved, but the working quiet of a place where things are happening that do not require noise. She thought, 5 years ago I was standing behind a column in the King's Great Hall, holding a book, trying to make myself smaller. She thought, and then someone walked toward me and said my name, and I looked to see if there was anyone standing behind me. She thought, there was no one behind me. She thought, there is no one behind me now either. I am exactly where I was walking toward, for all those years when I did not have the word for the direction. She did not call the thought anything. She filed it in the part of her mind that held the important things, the ones that did not need to be said aloud because they were already present in every room she occupied. She turned to the next letter. The list on her desk had one item, the North Road Review. She crossed it off. She had finished it this morning, before breakfast, in the first light, while the house was still quiet, and the frost was still on the field, and the tea was still going. She sat for a moment with the empty list. Then she turned to a fresh sheet and began the new one. There was always more work. She was glad of it. She wrote the first item, and then the second, and then the third, and the list grew the way lists do when you are paying attention, and the territory is large, and the work is real, and the morning is long, and everything, at last, is exactly where it is supposed to be. Lady Norville's reply to the Aldenmere proposal arrived 3 days later, and it was, as Marin had expected, an acceptance with 2 small modifications, both of which Marin had anticipated and one of which she had left space for. The language of the reply was more direct than Lady Norville's early letters had been. 5 years of correspondence had produced, between them, a working style that skipped the preliminary steps and went directly to the substance, the way any well-established professional relationship eventually learns to move. She filed the reply and drafted the joint submission to the county office. It was the final formalization of an arrangement that had been operating informally and effectively for 4 years. Making it formal did not change how it worked. It changed who knew that it worked, and that mattered for the next person who would need to use it after both of them had moved on to other concerns. This was one of the things she had come to understand about the work, that good management was not just solving problems but solving them in ways that survived the person who solved them. A solution that required her constant attention was only half a solution. A solution that was documented, formalized, and embedded in the records was a solution that would still be working 20 years from now, when neither she nor Lady Norville was available to maintain it personally. She wrote this into the preamble of the joint submission. Not in those words, county office submissions required a specific style, but the principle was there, the careful language that made the agreement self-explanatory, and the record complete enough that a future reader would understand not just what had been agreed, but why. Caspian read the submission before it went out, as he always did for formal documents. He said, "The preamble is good." She said, "The county office needs to understand the reasoning, not just the terms. It affects how they manage it when questions arise." He said, "I know. That is why it is good." He handed it back. She sent it. The formal county acknowledgement arrived the following week and was filed in the Norville correspondence folder, which was now 3 years thick and which she kept separately from the general territorial correspondence because the Norville relationship had been the first one and remained, in certain ways, the model for how the rest had developed. The Agricultural Review Committee letter came in the same week, a routine update on the upland water allocation system, which was performing correctly, and which had been performing correctly since it was implemented, and which the committee had recently cited in a paper submitted to the National Agricultural Council as an example of effective territorial water management. She read the citation twice. She did not feel proud, in a performed way. She felt the specific and grounded satisfaction of a person who built a thing correctly and can see that it works. The building had been hers. The working was its own. She told Caspian about the citation at dinner. He said, "The National Agricultural Council." She said, "The framework is in the footnotes of their working paper on territorial resource management." He said, "That is..." He paused in the way he paused when he needed to find the right word, and was not willing to use the wrong one. "That is significant." She said, "It is useful, which is what I built it to be." He said, "Useful and significant are not the same thing." She said, "I know. I am just being accurate about the intention." He said, "The intention and the result are both good." She said, "Yes." They finished dinner. The evening was warm enough to open the windows. It was the same warm that had been in the air when they arrived back from the capital, and she had been aware of it settling into the house, the particular spring warmth that was the end of the indoor months and the beginning of the outdoor ones. He said, "When do you want to go to Delia's?" She said, "Midsummer, after the road review is presented to the county committee." He said, "You already crossed off the road review." She said, "The work is done. The presentation is the following week." He said, "And after that?" She said, "Delia, and the South, and the children." He said, "You are looking forward to it." She said, "Delia's oldest asks her mother every letter when she is going to meet me. Delia writes it down exactly, the way the child says it." He said, "What does she say?" She says, "When is the aunt coming who knows about the water?" He said nothing for a moment. Then he laughed. It was a real laugh, not a social one. The kind that happens before a person decides to have it. The kind that means something was genuinely funny, rather than the kind of funny that polite company produces. She had heard him laugh before. Not frequently. It was always real when it happened. And each time she heard it, she was aware of it, the way you are aware, of a rare thing that has become less rare, that is becoming something you can count on. She said, "I told Delia I would explain it to her. The water routing systems are not complicated in principle. Children understand drainage better than adults because they have not yet decided it is dull." He said, "You are going to explain watershed management to a 6-year-old. She said, "I am going to explain why water goes where it goes, which is the same thing, at the right level." He said, "She will probably be very good at it." She said, "Delia says she is alarmingly quick at mathematics." He said, "I already know which side of the family that comes from." She said nothing, but she set her cup down with a precision that was not quite a response, and was not quite not a response. He said, "I want to go to the South." She said, "You have never been." He said, "I want to go now." She said, "Because of Delia's family?" He said, "Because you want to go, and I find that I want most things that you want. That is a recent development." She said, "Recent." He said, "In the past year, I have become aware of it." She said, "And before?" He said, "Before I wanted the things I had decided to want, and moved toward them with the available force. Now I notice what you want, and find I want it too. It is different." She looked at the window, the spring evening. She said, "That is," she chose the word carefully, "that is the nicest version of what has happened to both of us." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want you to go to the South." He said, "I know." She said, "I want you to meet Delia. She has wanted to meet you since the beginning. She has just been being polite about it." He said, "I suspected." She said, "Her letters are warm and practical, and she says what she means. You will like her immediately." He said, "I trust your assessment." She said, "You should. I have been right about everything." He said, "You have been right about most things." She said, "Name one thing I was wrong about." He said, "You thought Farwell would take 6 weeks to come around on the first framework. It was 3. She said, "I was conservative in my estimate. That is not the same as wrong." He said, "Semantics." She said, "Precision." He looked at her with the expression that was not quite amusement, and was not quite respect, and was in fact both, which had become, over 5 years, the expression she most associated with him, the one that appeared when he was looking at her and thinking something he did not feel the need to say, but was not hiding either. She said, "I am going to bed." He said, "It is early." She said, "I have the road presentation in the morning, and I want to review the summary notes before I sleep." He said, "You know the summary notes." She said, "I know. I want to read them again." He said, "Of course." She stood up. She picked up her cup. She said, "On the way out of the room, the appointment terms for the council position arrived this afternoon. I reviewed them this evening. There is one clause that needs amendment, the one about the timeline for formal opinions. 60 days is too long, 40 is sufficient, and keeps the council from using the delay as a mechanism." He said, "I will send the amendment tomorrow." She said, "I will draft it tonight." He said, "Marin." She stopped. He said, "You do not have to do it tonight." She said, "I want to." He said, "I know. Do it. But after you have read the summary notes." She said, "I know the order of things." He said, "Yes, you do." She went down the corridor. She could hear the house settling into the night, the sounds that had become, over 5 years, the sounds of the place where she was, the old stone, the staff making their final rounds, the particular quiet of a house that has been lived in well. She read the summary notes. She drafted the amendment. She read 3 pages of the book on the nightstand, which was a history of northern agricultural practice from the 18th century, because she was considering its relevance to the Western County Water Framework, and she wanted to finish it before the Farwell supplement was due. She read 3 pages and retained all of them. She put out the lamp. She lay in the dark and thought about nothing in particular, not the road presentation, not the council amendment, not the Western County Framework, nothing in particular. The ordinary thoughts of a person who has done the work for the day and is letting the mind do what it does when it is no longer directed anywhere. She thought, 5 years ago, I was standing behind a column. She thought, the column is still there, I am here. She thought, I am here in a way that I have never been anywhere before. She did not call it anything, she let it be what it was. She slept. In the morning, the spring light came through the window the way it came through at this hour, level and clean and without commentary, and the frost was off the north field because the season had turned, and the birds were doing what birds do in spring, and somewhere in the house the kitchen was starting, and the estate was being the estate, and the list on the desk had a first item on it for the new day. She got up. She put on her boots. She went to work.